Hey guys, tonight we're starting in a samurai village, a place where the day begins before sunrise. Everything smells faintly of pine and cold rice, and even kids are expected to bow with perfect form. It's quiet, strict, and honestly, you probably wouldn't last a day. From there, we'll wander with a swordsman who never lost a duel, step into hidden prayer rooms lit by candlelight, and end our night inside an Edo castle where silence spoke louder than swords. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slower, sleep-friendly dives into the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where in the world these late-night history trips are landing. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a samurai village, the day does not begin when the sun rises. It begins long before that, in silence and routine. Before first light, you might hear the faint, steady thud of wooden swords striking against wooden posts. Each strike is practiced, deliberate, and timed. The rhythm is not chaotic, but carefully controlled, repeating over and over without complaint or question. The sound carries through the pre-dawn air like a heartbeat, marking time in a world where time itself is measured not in hours, but in duties fulfilled. These wooden posts, worn smooth by countless strikes, stand sentinel in courtyards that have witnessed the same ritual for centuries. The bakken, carved from resilient oak or white oak, moves through the air with whispered precision. Each swing follows a pattern passed down through generations, a choreography of discipline that shapes both muscle and mind. In the darkness before dawn, the village breathes with collective purpose. Shadows move behind paper screens, each figure rising at the exact moment tradition demands. There is no snooze button here, no lingering in warmth. The body responds to internal discipline, trained through years of repetition to wake precisely when needed. This is not convenience, but necessity, a fundamental truth of samurai existence, where personal comfort dissolves into collective responsibility. Waking here means rising with purpose. There is no space for grogginess or slow mornings. You kneel on tatami mats, spine straight, and bow toward a kamadana, a small household shrine. This shrine holds the presence of protective spirits and ancestral memory. It may be decorated with white paper, small offerings of salt or rice, and perhaps a smooth stone resting on a wooden shelf. Before food or water, you give thanks, not through words, but with posture and stillness. The kamadana represents more than religious observance. It embodies the vertical connection between present duty and eternal responsibility. The white paper, folded into precise geometric shapes called shide, rustles slightly in the morning air that seeps through wooden walls. The salt, pure and crystalline, sits in a small ceramic dish that has served this purpose for decades. The rice, counted grain by grain, represents sustenance earned through service. These offerings are not tokens, but contracts, daily renewals of commitment to forces larger than individual desire. The bow itself follows strict protocol. The depth of the bow, the duration of the pause, the way the hands rest upon the knees, all communicate respect and understanding. This is not mere ritual, but language, a conversation with ancestors who once knelt in the same position, offering the same thanks, carrying the same burdens. The silence speaks louder than any prayer, acknowledging that some communications transcend words. Around the village, other families perform identical rituals. The synchronization is not planned, but inevitable, the result of shared training and common purpose. In houses both grand and modest, figures kneel in identical poses, their breathing regulated, their minds focused on the day ahead. This collective discipline creates an invisible network of mutual accountability, where individual failure becomes community shame. Washing is done with cold water drawn from a well or stored basin. There is no luxury here. Warmth is a rare comfort, saved for higher ranks or special occasions. Most mornings begin in cold silence. Even lighting a fire must be done with care and permission. The cold water serves multiple purposes beyond cleanliness. It shocks the system into alertness, washing away the softness of sleep. The basin, carved from wood or fired from local clay, holds water that was drawn the previous evening, allowing sediment to settle overnight. The act of washing follows precise movements. Hands first, then face, then neck, each gesture deliberate and efficient. In winter, ice forms on the water's surface, requiring gentle breaking before use. The crack of ice splitting sounds like a small bell, announcing the commitment to face discomfort without complaint. Servants, rising even earlier than their masters, ensure water is available but not warmed unless specifically requested. The cold becomes a daily test of resolve, a reminder that comfort must be earned rather than assumed. Fire represents both necessity and danger in the wooden village. Each flame must be carefully tended, never left unattended, always contained within proper boundaries. The permission to light a fire comes from understanding one's place in the hierarchy of responsibility. Lower-ranking members must wait for approval or assistance from those with proper authority. This creates a morning choreography where flames appear in order of rank, spreading warmth and light through the village according to social protocol. The charcoal used for fires comes from specific trees, prepared through careful burning that removes impurities while preserving heat capacity. The ash from these fires is collected and reused, nothing wasted in a world where efficiency equals survival. The smoke that rises from morning fires carries the scent of responsibility, marking the transition from night's stillness to day's activity. Outside, the village itself is quiet and perfectly arranged. Houses are placed according to social rank. A family of high-ranking samurai will live closer to the village center or near the estate of the local daimyo's representative. Lower-ranked samurai and foot soldiers, known as ashigaru, occupy simpler homes along the edges. Every door, garden wall, and pathway speaks silently of status. The physical layout of the village functions as a living map of power and responsibility. The central houses, constructed with higher quality timber and more elaborate joinery, demonstrate not wealth, but worthiness. Their position allows quick access to the administrative center while providing clear sightlines to all approaches. The gardens surrounding these homes feature carefully pruned trees and precisely raked gravel paths that require constant maintenance, displaying the owner's ability to command resources and attention to detail. Moving outward from the center, the houses become progressively simpler, but no less carefully constructed. Each level of housing reflects specific duties and privileges. The Ashigaru quarters, though modest, maintain the same standards of cleanliness and order expected throughout the village. Their smaller gardens might contain practical vegetables rather than ornamental plants, but every leaf and stem grows in deliberate arrangement. The pathways between houses follow geometric patterns that serve both practical and symbolic purposes. These routes ensure efficient movement during emergencies, while reinforcing social boundaries through their very design. Certain paths are reserved for specific ranks, creating invisible channels of movement that maintain order without requiring constant supervision. The architecture itself tells stories of discipline and sacrifice. Wooden joints fit together without nails, held by precision rather than force. Roof tiles align in perfect rows, each one placed according to ancient techniques that have weathered countless storms. The very walls breathe with the village's collective rhythm, expanding and contracting with seasonal changes while maintaining structural integrity across decades. If you are an outsider visiting this village, you would quickly feel the pressure of unspoken expectations. Here, every movement, every glance, every bow is part of a larger code. A bow that is too deep might signal submission. One that is too shallow could be seen as disrespectful. Making eye contact for too long might be misinterpreted as arrogance. Even standing in the wrong place could cause offense. The weight of constant observation presses down like invisible armor. Every gesture becomes a statement, every pause a potential mistake. The visiting outsider must navigate a labyrinth of social protocol, where the rules are assumed to be known, but never explicitly stated. This creates a state of hypervigilance, where the mind constantly calculates the implications of each action. The samurai's awareness extends beyond personal behavior to encompass the actions of everyone within their sphere of influence. A lord's retainer must monitor not only his own conduct, but also that of his servants, family members, and guests. This creates cascading layers of responsibility, where individual mistakes ripple through the entire social structure. The pressure to maintain perfect composure at all times becomes both a burden and a source of strength. Walking through the village requires understanding the subtle geography of respect. Certain stones in the path mark boundaries that must not be crossed without permission. The placement of sandals outside a door communicates the status of those within. The angle at which a sword is displayed indicates the readiness and rank of its owner. These signals form a complex communication system that operates continuously, requiring constant interpretation and response. The silence that pervades the village is not empty, but full of meaning. It carries the weight of things unsaid, protocols observed, and boundaries respected. This silence becomes a teacher, instructing newcomers in the art of restraint and observation. Learning to read these silences becomes as important as learning to wield a sword. Each household is bound to a quota of rice. This is the form of tax owed to the daimyo. The rice is measured, stored, and sometimes transported to castles far away. For those with larger holdings, managing the tax is a full-time responsibility. For poorer families, it often means stretching meals thin to meet the quota. Regardless of hardship, the tax must be paid. Rice is not just food. It is currency, duty, and survival. The rice quota system creates a complex web of obligation that binds every household to the larger political structure. The measurement of rice follows precise standards that have remained unchanged for generations. Wooden measuring boxes, carefully calibrated and officially sealed, ensure uniformity across the domain. The act of measuring becomes a ritual of submission, acknowledging the daimyo's authority over even the most basic sustenance. Storage of rice requires specialized knowledge and constant vigilance. The grain must be kept dry, protected from rodents, and rotated to prevent spoilage. Families construct elaborate storage systems using bamboo, wood, and clay, creating environments that preserve the rice's quality while allowing for accurate inventory. The responsibility for maintaining these stores falls primarily on the women of the household, who develop expertise in recognizing signs of deterioration and implementing preservation techniques. Transportation of rice to distant castles involves complex logistics that demonstrate the village's integration into larger political networks. Carriers, often ashigaru or specialized transporters, follow established routes that have been mapped and secured over decades. The journey requires careful planning, as the rice must arrive in perfect condition, despite weather, bandits, and other hazards. These expeditions become exercises in military organization, with detailed schedules and backup plans. The psychological impact of the rice quota extends far beyond its economic burden. It serves as a constant reminder of dependence and obligation, shaping daily decisions and long-term planning. Families must balance immediate needs against future requirements, creating a perpetual state of calculated scarcity. This mathematical relationship between survival and duty becomes embedded in the cultural consciousness, influencing everything from marriage arrangements to career choices. For those households that struggle to meet their quotas, the village provides both support and pressure. Neighbors may offer assistance, but such help creates its own obligations and debts. The shame of requiring aid becomes a powerful motivator, driving families to extraordinary efforts to maintain their independence. This creates a culture of mutual surveillance and support, where community solidarity exists alongside individual accountability. Boys of samurai families are trained from a young age to handle a wooden sword. By 5 or 6 years old, they practice their stances and footwork daily, not for games or competition, but to prepare them for a lifetime of discipline. Girls may be taught poetry, calligraphy, or the precise rituals of serving tea. Their role is no less governed by tradition. A daughter must know when to speak, how to write a proper letter, and how to fold clothing in perfect lines. Even play is restricted. There is no time for carelessness. The training of children begins before they can properly hold a sword. Observation comes first, as toddlers watch their fathers and older brothers perform their morning routines. They learn to recognize the different sounds of wood striking post, the rhythm of footwork, the controlled breathing that accompanies each movement. This early exposure creates neural pathways that will later support formal training, preparing the young mind to absorb complex physical and mental disciplines. The wooden sword or bakken, given to a child, is not a toy, but a tool of transformation. Its weight and balance are carefully chosen to match the child's developing strength and coordination. The wood itself, often selected from trees that have personal significance to the family, carries symbolic weight. Some families use wood from trees that provided weapons for ancestors, creating a material connection to hereditary duty. Daily practice for children follows a structured progression that builds capability while reinforcing social hierarchy. Younger children practice basic stances and simple movements, gradually advancing to more complex combinations as they demonstrate mastery and maturity. This system ensures that physical development parallels moral development, creating warriors who understand that strength serves duty rather than dominating it. The education of daughters follows equally rigorous patterns, though oriented toward different skills. Poetry instruction begins with memorization of classical works, developing both linguistic ability and cultural knowledge. The rhythm and structure of traditional verse trains the mind in pattern recognition and aesthetic appreciation, skills that will later inform all aspects of adult life. Calligraphy practice demands the same precision and discipline required for sword work, developing hand-eye coordination and mental focus through the controlled movement of brush and ink. Tea ceremony training represents perhaps the most complex element of female education. Every gesture, from the placement of the tea bowl to the timing of each pour, must be executed with perfect precision. This training develops spatial awareness, social sensitivity, and the ability to create harmony through controlled action. The ceremony itself becomes a form of meditation, teaching patience, attention to detail, and the art of creating beauty through service. The restriction of play serves multiple purposes beyond simple discipline. It prevents the formation of habits that might later interfere with serious training. Children learn early that their actions have consequences, that carelessness can lead to mistakes that affect not only themselves, but their families and communities. This creates a mindset where vigilance becomes natural, where the constant awareness of potential consequences shapes all behavior. Even the games that are permitted carry educational value. Traditional games like Kimari, where players keep a ball aloft using only their feet, develop balance, coordination, and the ability to work harmoniously with others. These activities teach that skill serves group success rather than individual glory, reinforcing the social values that will govern adult life. Meals are shared, but quietly. A bowl of rice, a few pickled vegetables, perhaps a slice of dried fish. Food is eaten seated, with perfect posture, and in most homes, there is very little conversation. Gratitude is expressed not through words, but through the careful way one handles each bowl and chopstick. The sharing of meals represents one of the most intimate expressions of social hierarchy and mutual obligation. The arrangement of family members around the low table follows strict protocols that reflect both age and status. The father sits in the position of honor, facing the room's entrance, while other family members arrange themselves according to their roles and responsibilities. This seating arrangement creates a visual representation of the family's internal structure, reinforcing relationships and duties through spatial organization. The food itself, simple though it may appear, represents complex networks of production, exchange, and obligation. The rice comes from fields that the family either owns or works under specific arrangements with local lords. The vegetables, often pickled to preserve them through seasons of scarcity, demonstrate the household's ability to plan and prepare for future needs. The fish, caught in distant waters or raised in local ponds, connects the family to broader economic networks that span the domain. The act of eating becomes a form of meditation, requiring complete attention to the present moment. The texture of rice, the saltiness of pickled vegetables, the delicate flavor of fish, all receive careful consideration. This mindful consumption serves multiple purposes. It maximizes the nutritional value of simple foods, demonstrates proper appreciation for resources, and trains the mind in the art of focused attention. The handling of chopsticks and bowls follows precise protocols that have been refined over generations. The way one holds chopsticks communicates social background and personal discipline. The angle at which a bowl is lifted, the sound it makes when placed on the table, the order in which different foods are consumed, all carry social meaning. These details create a complex language of respect and propriety that operates below the threshold of conscious communication. The quietness that pervades mealtimes is not simply the absence of noise, but the presence of focused attention. Each person concentrates on their food, their posture, their breathing, creating a shared meditative state. This silence allows for subtle communication through gesture and expression, fostering a form of intimacy that transcends words. The family learns to read each other's moods and needs through careful observation, developing emotional intelligence that will serve them throughout their lives. The gratitude expressed through careful handling of utensils and bowls reflects deep philosophical principles about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Each grain of rice represents the labor of farmers, the blessing of weather, the fertility of soil. The ceramic bowls embody the skills of potters, the patience of firing, the aesthetic sensibilities of their creators. This awareness of interconnection creates a sense of responsibility that extends far beyond the immediate family to encompass the entire web of relationships that makes life possible. Training continues through the day. In the central courtyard, men and boys may line up barefoot on packed earth, repeating sword movements in perfect unison. Their bodies move as one. When a voice calls for a strike, it is not loud or passionate. It is firm and brief. The discipline here is absolute, not theatrical. These are not performances. They are habits that shape the body and the mind. The central courtyard serves as the village's heart, a space where individual training merges into collective discipline. The packed earth, worn smooth by countless bare feet, provides a surface that connects the practitioners directly to the ground, eliminating the barrier between body and earth. This physical connection reinforces the spiritual principle that true strength comes from being rooted in fundamental realities rather than elevated above them. The synchronization of movement creates a powerful psychological effect that transcends individual capability. When dozens of wooden swords move in perfect unison, they generate a visual and auditory rhythm that entrains the minds of all participants. This collective state allows for levels of focus and coordination that would be impossible to achieve through individual effort alone. The group becomes a single organism, breathing and moving as one. The commands that guide these sessions follow traditional patterns that have been refined over centuries. Each instruction is stripped of unnecessary words, communicating essential information with maximum clarity. A tone of voice carries just enough authority to ensure compliance without creating tension or distraction. These verbal cues become triggers for specific physical and mental states, allowing practitioners to shift instantly from rest to readiness. The movements themselves encode centuries of martial wisdom, each gesture representing solutions to specific combat challenges. The way a sword is drawn, the angle of a cut, the positioning of feet, all reflect deep understanding of human anatomy, physics, and psychology. This knowledge is transmitted through repetition rather than explanation, allowing the body to absorb lessons that the conscious mind might struggle to comprehend. The absence of theatrical elements serves important pedagogical purposes. Without dramatic flourishes or emotional displays, practitioners learn to find satisfaction in precision rather than performance. This develops internal motivation based on the pursuit of excellence rather than external recognition. The quiet intensity of these sessions creates a meditative quality that transforms physical training into spiritual practice. The progression from individual technique to group coordination teaches valuable lessons about leadership and followership. Each practitioner must master their own movements while remaining sensitive to the rhythm and energy of the group. This requires a delicate balance between self-discipline and social awareness, skills that will prove essential in all aspects of samurai life. The physical demands of training on packed earth, without protective footwear, toughen the body while teaching important lessons about adaptation and resilience. The feet develop calluses that protect against rough surfaces, while the legs and core strengthen to maintain balance on uneven terrain. This physical conditioning prepares warriors for the realities of combat and travel, where comfort and convenience are rarely available. Entertainment is rare and never casual. In wealthier homes, there may be a scroll to read or a musical instrument like a bamboo flute. On special nights, a no-play might be performed, its slow gestures and masks telling stories with minimal sound. But even these are formal events, watched in stillness. The rarity of entertainment creates a heightened appreciation for cultural experiences when they do occur. A single scroll containing classical poetry or philosophical teachings might be read and reread countless times, each encounter revealing new layers of meaning. The scarcity of such materials makes their contents precious, encouraging deep contemplation rather than casual consumption. This intense engagement with limited cultural resources develops sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and intellectual depth. The bamboo flute, crafted from carefully selected bamboo that has been aged and seasoned, produces sounds that blend with the natural environment rather than dominating it. The music created on such instruments follows traditional patterns that have been passed down through generations, each melody carrying cultural and emotional associations that connect the performer to historical continuity. Playing these instruments requires breath control and finger dexterity that complement martial training, creating physical skills that serve multiple purposes. No performances represent the pinnacle of cultural refinement, combining drama, music, dance, and spiritual instruction in a single art form. The masks worn by performers, carved from wood and painted with mineral pigments, transform the actor into archetypal figures that embody universal human experiences. The slow, deliberate movements of no drama teach patience and attention to detail, while the symbolic language of gesture and costume educates audiences in cultural values and historical knowledge. The formal nature of these entertainment experiences serves important social functions. They provide opportunities for community gathering while reinforcing social hierarchies and cultural values. The seating arrangements at such events, the protocol for entering and leaving, the appropriate responses to different types of performance, all teach and reinforce social skills that maintain community harmony. The stillness required of audiences develops important personal qualities. The ability to sit motionless for extended periods, to focus attention on subtle artistic elements, to find meaning in minimal stimulation, all contribute to the development of inner strength and emotional control. These skills prove valuable in all aspects of life, from formal ceremonies to combat situations. The stories told through no plays often draw from historical events, classical literature, or religious teachings, serving as vehicles for cultural transmission. Audiences learn about their heritage, their values, and their place in the larger scheme of existence through these carefully crafted narratives. The combination of entertainment and education creates powerful learning experiences that shape consciousness and behavior. As evening arrives, the village does not grow louder. It grows quieter. Lanterns glow behind thin paper walls. Shadows move softly inside wooden rooms. The air cools, and the scent of burning pine drifts gently through the narrow streets. Somewhere, a father recites a classical text while a son listens in perfect stillness. A woman folds a kimono with slow, practiced movements. A servant finishes sweeping a path that barely needed sweeping at all. The transition from day to evening follows natural rhythms that have been elevated to artistic principles. As sunlight fades, the village transforms into a landscape of gentle illumination and soft shadows. The paper walls of houses become translucent screens that reveal the silhouettes of inhabitants while maintaining privacy. This creates a sense of community intimacy where neighbors remain aware of each other's activities without intruding upon personal space. The lanterns that provide evening illumination are works of art in themselves. Constructed from bamboo frames, covered with handmade paper, they cast warm, steady light that creates atmosphere without harsh glare. The oil that fuels these lanterns is carefully rationed and maintained, making each source of light precious and meaningful. The placement of lanterns follows aesthetic principles that balance practical illumination with visual beauty, creating landscapes that please the eye while serving functional needs. The scent of burning pine that drifts through the evening air carries multiple layers of meaning. Pine wood, selected for its clean burning properties and pleasant aroma, connects the village to the surrounding forest while creating a sensory signature that marks the transition from day to night. This olfactory element becomes part of the village's identity, a subtle but powerful component of the total sensory experience that shapes memory and emotion. The father reciting classical texts to his son represents the continuous transmission of cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. These recitations, performed from memory, ensure that important teachings remain alive in the community's consciousness. The rhythm and melody of classical language, with its formal structures and elevated vocabulary, trains the ear and mind in aesthetic appreciation while conveying essential philosophical and practical knowledge. The woman folding the kimono demonstrates the elevation of mundane tasks to the level of art. Each fold follows precise geometric principles that preserve the garment's shape while creating visually pleasing arrangements. The care taken in this simple task reflects broader cultural values about the relationship between efficiency and beauty, showing how daily activities can become forms of meditation and expressions of personal discipline. The servant's careful sweeping of an already clean path exemplifies the principle that maintenance of standards requires constant attention rather than occasional effort. This seemingly unnecessary activity serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates respect for the environment, maintains the habit of thoroughness, and creates opportunities for quiet reflection. The repetitive nature of such tasks provides a form of moving meditation that calms the mind while serving practical ends. And so the day ends much like it began, not in excitement or chaos, but in careful repetition. Every gesture, every task, performed exactly as it has been for generations. The cyclical nature of daily life in the samurai village creates a sense of continuity that transcends individual existence. Each person participates in patterns that connect them to ancestors and descendants, creating a temporal community that extends far beyond the physical village. This continuity provides psychological stability and spiritual meaning, offering individuals a sense of purpose that extends beyond personal desires and immediate needs. The careful repetition that characterizes village life serves as a form of collective memory, preserving cultural knowledge and values through embodied practice rather than written instruction. Each repeated gesture carries forward the accumulated wisdom of generations, ensuring that essential knowledge remains accessible, even if formal records are lost or destroyed. This creates a resilient cultural system that can survive political upheavals and social changes. The precision required in daily tasks develops habits of mind that prove valuable in all aspects of life. The attention to detail learned through household routines translates directly to martial skill, administrative competence, and artistic achievement. This integration of ordinary and extraordinary activities creates a holistic approach to human development that recognizes no separation between practical and spiritual pursuits. But you would feel its weight almost immediately. The weight of constant observation, constant expectation, and constant restraint. In a samurai village, identity is not something you choose. It is something assigned, inherited, and performed. The weight of constant observation creates a unique form of social pressure that shapes behavior in profound ways. Every action becomes a public statement. Every choice a reflection of personal character and social position. This creates a heightened sense of responsibility that extends beyond individual consequences to encompass family honor, community stability, and cultural continuity. The knowledge that one's behavior will be remembered and judged by future generations adds gravity to even the simplest decisions. The expectations that govern village life are so deeply embedded in daily routines that they become invisible to those who have grown up within the system. For outsiders, however, these expectations create a constant state of uncertainty and anxiety. The fear of making mistakes, of inadvertently causing offense, of revealing ignorance about fundamental social protocols generates psychological stress that can be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to such structured environments. The restraint required in all aspects of behavior demands tremendous emotional control and mental discipline. Natural impulses toward spontaneity, emotional expression, and personal preference must be constantly monitored and regulated. This creates a form of internal tension that can be either strengthening or destructive, depending on one's ability to find meaning and satisfaction within imposed limitations. The assignment of identity through birth and social position eliminates many of the anxieties associated with modern concepts of self-determination, but it also removes the possibility of radical self-transformation. Individuals must find fulfillment within prescribed roles rather than creating entirely new identities. This creates a different form of personal development, one based on deepening understanding and perfecting performance rather than exploring alternative possibilities. The inheritance of identity through family lineage creates strong bonds between generations, while also imposing heavy burdens of expectation. Children must live up to ancestral achievements, while also preparing to pass traditions on to their own descendants. This creates a sense of temporal responsibility that extends far beyond individual lifespans, connecting personal choices to historical consequences. The performance of identity through daily behavior transforms abstract social concepts into concrete physical realities. The way one walks, speaks, eats, and interacts with others becomes a continuous demonstration of internal values and social position. This embodied approach to identity creation ensures that cultural values remain alive and meaningful rather than becoming mere intellectual concepts. To last a day here requires more than strength. It requires unshakable patience, unwavering formality, and a calm acceptance of your place. This is a world where nothing is random, where even silence carries meaning. The patience required for samurai village life extends far beyond simple waiting. It demands the ability to find satisfaction in gradual progress, to appreciate subtle changes, to recognize that meaningful achievement often requires years or decades of consistent effort. This patience must be cultivated through practice, developing the emotional resilience necessary to maintain focus and motivation despite minimal external rewards. The formality that governs all social interactions serves as a framework for respectful communication and peaceful coexistence. Every conversation follows established protocols that ensure all parties understand their roles and responsibilities. This creates predictability and safety in social encounters, reducing the potential for misunderstanding and conflict while providing clear guidelines for appropriate behavior. The acceptance of one's place in the social hierarchy represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of village life for modern sensibilities. This acceptance must be genuine rather than merely compliant, requiring individuals to find meaning and satisfaction within assigned roles rather than constantly seeking advancement or change. This creates a different form of personal fulfillment, one based on excellence within defined parameters rather than unlimited expansion of possibilities. The absence of randomness in village life creates a sense of order and predictability that can be either comforting or oppressive, depending on one's perspective. Every event, every interaction, every daily routine follows established patterns that connect individual experience to larger cultural meanings. This creates a world where cause and effect relationships are clearly understood, where actions have predictable consequences, and where individuals can find security in knowing exactly what is expected of them. The meaningful silence that pervades village life represents a sophisticated form of communication that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. The timing of pauses, the quality of attention, the subtle shifts in posture and expression all carry information that supplements or sometimes contradicts spoken words. Learning to read and participate in these silent communications requires years of careful observation and practice. Now, step with quiet respect beyond the village walls, where the structure of duty gives way to the solitary road. In the next part of our journey, we walk beside a man who followed no master, answered to no lord, and shaped his life through motion and stillness. Let us turn to the path of Miyamoto Musashi, the lone swordsman who wandered through Japan's stillness with a blade at his side and a philosophy in his mind. The physical boundaries of the village itself tell stories of protection and limitation. Stone markers, weathered by centuries of rain and wind, define the exact perimeter where village law gives way to the broader world. These markers, carved with the family crests of founding lords, serve as both boundaries and promises, marking the limits of protection while acknowledging the responsibilities that extend beyond them. Children learn early to recognize these stones, understanding that crossing them means entering a realm where village customs no longer provide safety or guidance. The gates that mark the village's main entrances stand as monuments to controlled access and regulated movement. Constructed from massive timbers, joined with iron reinforcements, these gates can withstand both natural disasters and human threats. The guards who watch these passages maintain detailed records of all who enter and leave, creating a continuous documentation of the village's relationship with the outside world. These records, stored in carefully maintained ledgers, become part of the village's historical memory, tracking the flow of people, goods, and information across generations. The seasonal rhythms that govern village life create a complex calendar of obligations and opportunities. Spring brings the intensive labor of rice planting, where every able-bodied person contributes to the collective effort of preparing fields, transplanting seedlings, and maintaining the intricate irrigation systems that sustain the crop. Summer demands constant vigilance against pests, weather, and disease, requiring knowledge passed down through generations about the subtle signs that indicate when action must be taken. Autumn brings the harvest, a time of both celebration and anxiety, as the year's survival depends on the successful gathering and storage of grain. Winter provides the only respite from agricultural demands, allowing time for equipment maintenance, skill development, and the quiet contemplation that prepares minds and bodies for the cycle's renewal. The economic relationships that bind the village to the larger feudal system create networks of obligation that extend far beyond rice quotas. Specialized craftsmen, from blacksmiths to pottery makers, produce goods that serve both local needs and external trade requirements. The quality of these products reflects directly on the village's reputation, making every hammer blow and brush stroke a matter of collective pride. The apprenticeship systems that train these craftsmen follow rigid protocols that ensure knowledge transmission while maintaining quality standards across generations. The marriage customs that govern family formation serve both personal and political purposes, creating alliances that strengthen the village while ensuring genetic and cultural continuity. These arrangements, negotiated through careful consideration of family histories, economic resources, and social compatibility, represent investments in the community's future stability. The ceremonies that celebrate these unions follow ancient protocols that invoke ancestral blessing while establishing new networks of mutual obligation and support. The transition from village life to the wandering path represents one of the most dramatic transformations possible in feudal Japanese society. While the village provides structure, community, and clear purpose, the road offers freedom, uncertainty, and the possibility of self-discovery. This contrast creates a powerful tension that drives the narrative forward, inviting readers to explore what happens when the carefully constructed world of social obligation gives way to the raw challenge of individual survival and growth. The figure of Musashi represents the ultimate expression of samurai independence, a man who chose to forge his own path rather than accept the comfortable constraints of established society. His journey from the structured world of the village to the uncertain freedom of the road embodies the eternal human struggle between security and authenticity, between social acceptance and personal truth. As we prepare to follow his footsteps, we must also prepare to leave behind the safety of known expectations and venture into a realm where every day brings new challenges and new possibilities for both triumph and failure. The road stretches forward, unpaved and uneven, cutting gently through pine forests and farmland. The sky above is wide and pale, brushed with morning haze. And walking alone along this quiet road, carrying 2 swords and a bundle of sparse belongings, is a man who has no home, no lord, and no destination fixed in stone. This is Miyamoto Musashi, a figure both real and wrapped in quiet legend. Not a warrior in shining armor or a general with marching men behind him, but a solitary presence who spent most of his life on the move. If you passed him by on the road, you might not look twice. His robes were plain. His hair was often unkempt. Yet beneath the surface, he carried a mind as sharp and deliberate as any blade. The Japan of his time was a place of transformation, caught between old certainties and new realities. The great military campaigns of unification were drawing to a close. Oda Nobunaga had already swept across the central provinces like wildfire, demolishing the power of Buddhist monasteries and crushing resistance with calculated brutality. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had built upon that foundation, bringing most of the country under his control through a mixture of political cunning and overwhelming force. Now, as the 16th century neared its end, the world was shifting once again toward the iron grip of Tokugawa rule. Into this landscape of change came Musashi, born around 1584 in the province of Harima. His birth name was Shinmin Takezo, and his father was likely a minor samurai, or perhaps a practitioner of martial arts who ran a small school. The details of his early childhood remain shadowy, filtered through centuries of retelling. But what emerges is the image of a boy who learned violence early and learned it well. The traditional story tells us that his father abandoned him or died when Musashi was still young, leaving the boy to fend for himself in a world that showed little mercy to the weak or unprepared. Whether this is literal truth or symbolic representation matters less than what it reveals about the man he became. Musashi would carry the mark of abandonment with him throughout his life, never fully settling anywhere, never completely trusting in the permanence of human bonds. According to most accounts, Musashi fought his first duel at the age of 13. The details are spare, and much has been softened by time, but the outcome was clear. He survived, and he continued. His opponent was a grown man named Arima Kihei, a warrior from the Shinto-ryu school who had issued a challenge that was meant to be more demonstration than deathmatch. But the boy who faced him carried something different in his eyes. When the wooden swords clashed, when the moment came to pull back and acknowledge skill, Musashi did not stop. He pressed forward with a fury that surprised everyone present, including perhaps himself. Arima Kihei fell, struck down by a strike that was both perfectly timed and utterly without mercy. The victory changed everything. Word spread quickly through the local communities about the young fighter who had defeated an experienced warrior. Challenges began to arrive. Some came from curiosity, others from wounded pride, and still others from the simple desire to test one's skill against a rising reputation. Musashi accepted them all. For years afterward, he traveled across Japan, seeking opponents, not for vengeance, nor wealth, nor glory, but to refine a deeper understanding. The roads he walked were not the carefully maintained highways of later periods, but rough tracks that wound through mountain passes, across rice fields, and between small villages where news traveled slowly and strangers were viewed with suspicion. He carried everything he owned in a simple bundle. A spare robe, perhaps, a writing brush and ink, a small amount of rice or coins when he could come by them. But mostly, he carried questions. About technique, about timing, about the nature of combat itself. Musashi believed that true mastery of the sword was also mastery of the self. Each duel was not just a test of strength or speed, but of rhythm, timing, observation, and intention. The Japan through which he wandered was a place of extraordinary complexity beneath its apparent simplicity. In the cities, merchants were growing wealthy from trade, and artisans were developing new techniques in metalworking, pottery, and textile production. The rigid class system was beginning to solidify, with samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. But in the countryside, in the small villages, and on the lonely mountain paths, older ways persisted. Local strongmen still held sway over their territories. Bandits operated with impunity in remote areas. And wandering warriors like Musashi could still make their way by skill and reputation alone. His style was unusual. While most samurai wielded a single long sword with two hands, Musashi developed a method of using both a long sword and a short one at the same time. This was not merely a technical innovation, but a philosophical statement. The conventional wisdom held that mastery came through perfection of a single approach, through endless repetition until every movement became automatic. Musashi rejected this. He believed that true understanding came through adaptation, through the ability to respond to any situation with whatever tools were available. This philosophy extended far beyond swordplay into every aspect of his existence. When he needed shelter, he did not seek out inns or temples, but learned to read the landscape for caves, overhangs, and natural windbreaks. When he required food, he did not depend on charity or commerce, but developed skills in hunting, foraging, and the preparation of simple meals from whatever ingredients the countryside provided. When he needed income, he did not attach himself to wealthy patrons, but offered his services as needed, teaching, demonstrating, sometimes serving as a yojimbo or bodyguard for merchants traveling dangerous roads. This self-sufficiency was not mere stubbornness, but a deliberate cultivation of independence that freed him from the social obligations that constrained other samurai. While his contemporaries navigated complex webs of duty and loyalty, Musashi remained accountable only to his own understanding of what was necessary and right. This freedom came at a cost: loneliness, uncertainty, a constant need to prove himself to skeptical strangers. But it also provided something invaluable: the ability to pursue truth without compromise. His technique was part of a larger school of thought he eventually called Naiten Ichi-Ru, or Two Heavens as One School. The name itself suggests the philosophical underpinnings of his approach. Heaven and earth, active and passive, attack and defense. These were not opposing forces to be balanced, but complementary aspects of a single reality. To wield two swords simultaneously was to embody this principle in physical form. The development of this dual sword technique required years of solitary experimentation. Traditional schools focused on the katana, the long sword that was the soul of the samurai class. The shorter wakizashi was considered a backup weapon used only when the primary blade was lost or damaged. Musashi saw this as a waste of potential. Why carry two swords if you could only use one effectively? His innovation went beyond mere technique to challenge fundamental assumptions about combat itself. Most martial traditions emphasize the concentration of force, putting maximum power behind a single, decisive strike. Musashi's approach distributed force across multiple vectors, creating complexity it was difficult for opponents to predict or counter. While they prepared for one attack, he delivered two. While they focused on his primary weapon, his secondary blade found openings they had not anticipated. This required not just physical coordination, but mental flexibility of an extraordinary degree. The mind accustomed to tracking a single line of attack had to learn to perceive multiple possibilities simultaneously. The body trained to move as a unified whole had to develop the ability to act independently on both sides while maintaining overall balance and control. It was like learning to have a conversation with two people at once while walking a tightrope demanding every aspect of attention and skill. The philosophical implications were equally profound. By mastering the use of two swords, Musashi was demonstrating a principle that applied to all aspects of life: the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to act from several centers of awareness at once, to be both aggressive and defensive, both flexible and firm, both present and anticipatory. This was not contradiction, but integration, the achievement of a state of being that transcended the limitations of either or thinking. But developing this technique required more than theoretical understanding. It demanded thousands of hours of practice, alone in forests and empty fields, working through the complex choreography of coordinated strikes. The physical demands were enormous. Each hand had to develop independent strength and precision while maintaining perfect coordination with the other. The mind had to track multiple targets and possibilities simultaneously, and the body had to remain balanced and fluid despite the asymmetrical nature of the weapons. Musashi approached this challenge with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything else. He would practice basic movements for hours, then combine them into sequences, then test those sequences against imaginary opponents. He studied the way water flowed around rocks, the way wind moved through trees, the way shadows shifted across the ground. Everything became a lesson in movement, timing, and adaptation. But even more than his swordplay, it was Musashi's presence that set him apart. He often arrived for duels late or unwashed, frustrating opponents who expected precise formality. This was not mere rudeness, but calculated psychology. By disrupting the expected ritual of formal combat, he forced his opponents to adapt, to question their assumptions, to fight his battle rather than their own. He studied their habits, their weaknesses, and struck not with rage, but with calm. Always calm. This calmness was perhaps his greatest weapon. While his opponents fought with passion, with pride, with the desire to prove themselves worthy of their training and their reputation, Musashi fought with the detachment of a craftsman solving a technical problem. He observed their patterns, identified their preferences, and then exploited the gaps in their defenses with surgical precision. This approach required a kind of emptiness that was difficult for conventional warriors to understand. Most fighters drew their strength from emotion, anger at insults, determination to uphold honor, loyalty to their schools or masters. Musashi had learned to fight from a place of complete neutrality, treating each encounter as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a contest to be won. This did not make him cold or mechanical, but rather intensely present and responsive to each moment as it unfolded. His victories accumulated not through superior strength or speed, but through superior awareness. He could read the subtle signs that preceded an attack, the slight tension in an opponent's shoulders, the shift in breathing, the almost imperceptible change in stance that indicated commitment to a particular technique. Where others saw only the surface drama of clashing blades, Musashi perceived the deeper currents of intention and reaction that determined the outcome before the first strike was thrown. This skill in reading others extended beyond combat into all his interactions. Merchants found it difficult to overcharge him because he could sense their calculations. Innkeepers discovered that their usual strategies for managing troublesome guests were ineffective against someone who anticipated their moves. Even casual conversations revealed depths of understanding that made others uncomfortable, not because Musashi was judgmental, but because his attention was so complete that people felt truly seen, perhaps for the first time in their lives. The psychological dimension of his combat approach was as carefully developed as the physical. He understood that most people fought not just with their bodies, but with their self-image, their need to maintain dignity, their fear of appearing weak or foolish. By disrupting these psychological patterns, arriving late, appearing unkempt, using unconventional weapons, he could defeat opponents before the actual fighting began. They would be so focused on adapting to his unpredictability that they lost access to their own best techniques. This was not mere gamesmanship, but a profound understanding of human nature. Musashi recognized that the opponent most difficult to defeat was oneself, one's own expectations, assumptions, and habitual patterns of thought and action. By forcing others to confront these internal obstacles, he was teaching them as much as defeating them. Many of his opponents, if they survived the encounter, found themselves changed by the experience in ways that went far beyond the immediate lesson in swordplay. One of his most famous encounters was against Sasaki Kojiro, a well-known swordsman whose blade was rumored to be as long as a man's arm. Kojiro was everything Musashi was not: elegant, refined, attached to a powerful lord, and celebrated for the beauty of his technique. His signature move was called the swallow cut, a strike so swift and precise that it could supposedly cut a bird from the sky. The duel took place on a remote island called Ganryujima, in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The location was chosen for its isolation. Such encounters were becoming increasingly problematic for the authorities, who preferred the stability of peace to the chaos of individual combat. Musashi is said to have carved a wooden sword from an oar during the boat ride there, a detail that has become legendary, but which perfectly captures his approach to combat. While Kojiro arrived on time, dressed in his finest robes and carrying his famous blade, Musashi was characteristically late. He had spent the morning preparing, not his weapons or his appearance, but his mind. He studied the wind patterns, the angle of the sun, the texture of the sand on the beach where they would fight. When he finally arrived, Kojiro was already frustrated, his calm disrupted by the wait. The fight itself was brief. Kojiro's first strike was his masterpiece, the swallow cut delivered with perfect form and devastating speed. But Musashi was no longer where the blade expected to find him. He had moved not just his body, but his entire presence, shifting in a way that made Kojiro's perfect technique strike empty air. And in that moment of overextension, Musashi struck once with his wooden sword, a blow that found its mark with finality. The victory was more than a technical triumph. It was a demonstration of everything Musashi had learned about the nature of conflict and resolution. Kojiro had fought with the accumulated wisdom of his school, the confidence of his reputation, and the support of his patron. He had prepared meticulously, chosen the location, and arrived in perfect condition. Yet all of this preparation had become a kind of trap, limiting his ability to respond to the unexpected. Musashi, by contrast, had approached the duel with what Buddhist philosophy might call beginner's mind, a state of openness and receptivity that allowed him to perceive the situation fresh, without the burden of preconceptions. His wooden sword was not a sign of disrespect, but a practical response to circumstances. His tardiness was not rudeness, but a way of gathering information about wind, light, and terrain. His apparent casualness masked a level of preparation that went far deeper than conventional training. The aftermath of the duel revealed as much about Musashi's character as the fight itself. He did not linger to receive praise or to ensure that word of his victory spread. He did not take trophies or make speeches about his superior technique. He simply acknowledged what had occurred, paid his respects to his fallen opponent, and departed. This restraint was not false modesty, but genuine understanding that the duel had been about learning, not winning, and that the real victory lay in the insights gained rather than in the reputation earned. News of Kojiro's defeat traveled throughout Japan, but by the time it reached most people, Musashi had already moved on to other challenges and other lessons. He had proven what he needed to prove about the effectiveness of his approach, but more importantly, he had reached a point where external validation was no longer necessary. The path forward would be increasingly inward, focused on understanding the deeper principles that made technique possible rather than on developing new techniques themselves. He used that makeshift weapon to strike down Kojiro with a single, carefully timed blow. Then, without boasting, he left the island and disappeared back into the trees. The victory established his reputation across all of Japan, but it also marked the beginning of a change in his approach to combat. He had proven what he needed to prove about technique and timing. Now he began to ask deeper questions about the nature of conflict itself. As the years passed, Musashi began to turn inward. The duels became fewer, the reflections deeper. He painted, practiced calligraphy, carved wooden sculptures, and spent long periods alone in the mountains. This was not retirement, but evolution. Having mastered the external aspects of combat, he now sought to understand the internal dimensions of conflict and resolution. The transition from warrior to artist was not as dramatic as it might seem. The same qualities that made Musashi formidable in combat, complete attention, perfect timing, the ability to perceive subtle relationships, served him equally well in creative pursuits. His brush moved across paper with the same decisive confidence that had characterized his swordwork. His eye for composition reflected the same understanding of space and movement that had made him unbeatable in duels. But there was something more at work than simple transfer of skills. Art provided Musashi with a new language for exploring ideas that could not be fully expressed through martial technique alone. Where swordplay was necessarily concerned with immediate practical results, artistic creation allowed for more subtle and complex communications. A painting could suggest rather than state, could evoke rather than demonstrate, could capture the essence of something without being limited by its surface appearance. His artistic subjects often reflected themes from his martial practice, but approached from unexpected angles. A painting of a bird might explore the principle of perfect timing, a moment when the creature commits to flight, when potential becomes kinetic, when stillness transforms into motion. A landscape might examine the relationship between emptiness and form, showing how negative space could be as important as positive elements in creating a harmonious composition. The process of creation itself became a form of meditation. Unlike the explosive immediacy of combat, artistic work required sustained attention over extended periods. A single painting might take days or weeks to complete, each session demanding the same quality of presence that Musashi had brought to his duels. This extended engagement with a single focus taught him new things about the nature of attention itself, how it could be maintained without strain, how it could deepen rather than diminish over time, how it could discover new dimensions within apparently simple subjects. His calligraphy, too, reflected his martial philosophy. The characters flowed with the same fluid grace he brought to swordwork, each stroke perfectly timed and placed. He often wrote single words or short phrases that captured essential truths: spirit, void, water, mountain. These were not merely artistic exercises, but meditations on the fundamental nature of existence. The act of writing these characters, was itself a form of practice. Each stroke required the same commitment that a sword cut demanded. Once begun, it could not be revised or corrected. The brush had to move with complete confidence, guided by understanding that went deeper than conscious planning. A moment's hesitation or doubt would be immediately visible in the quality of the line, just as uncertainty in combat would create openings for an opponent to exploit. Through calligraphy, Musashi explored the relationship between meaning and form, between the idea a character represented and the physical gesture required to create it. He discovered that the most powerful writing emerged not from trying to make the characters beautiful, but from fully embodying the concepts they expressed. When he wrote mountain, his brush moved with the solidity and permanence of stone. When he wrote water, the ink flowed with liquid grace. This was not mere technique, but a form of sympathetic magic, becoming what one depicted in the very act of depiction. The wooden sculptures he carved were perhaps the most revealing of his artistic pursuits. Working with only a knife and his hands, he created figures that seemed to emerge from the wood itself, rather than being imposed upon it. This approach paralleled his understanding of combat, not as a matter of forcing one's will upon an opponent, but of finding the natural resolution that already existed within the situation. Each piece of wood presented its own unique challenges and possibilities. The grain might suggest the flow of a robe. The natural curve of a branch might become the arc of a sword. A knot in the timber might transform into the focused expression of a meditating monk. Musashi learned to read these natural patterns, the same way he had learned to read the intentions of opponents, not fighting against what was already there, but working with it to reveal hidden potentials. The carving process itself demanded a different kind of attention than either painting or calligraphy. Wood was unforgiving of mistakes in a way that ink was not. A misplaced cut could not be easily corrected, and the three-dimensional nature of the medium meant that decisions had consequences that might not become apparent until much later in the process. This required a level of planning and forethought that was foreign to someone accustomed to the immediate responsiveness of combat. Yet it also taught patience and the ability to think several moves ahead. More importantly, working with wood connected Musashi to the natural world in a direct, physical way. The material had once been alive, had grown according to its own internal logic, had responded to seasons and weather and the countless small influences that shaped its development. To carve it was to engage in a kind of dialogue with these forces, to understand something about the relationship between form and process, between what was and what could be. These solitary periods in the mountains were not escapes from the world, but deeper engagements with it. Away from the distractions of human society, Musashi could observe the fundamental patterns that governed all existence. He watched how water carved channels through stone, how roots found their way through seemingly solid earth, how storms gathered and dissipated according to laws more subtle than any human strategy. The natural world became his teacher in ways that no human instructor could match. Mountains demonstrated the principle of immovable stability, yet also showed how even the most solid formations were constantly changing, wearing away grain by grain, rebuilding themselves through geological processes too slow for human perception. Rivers taught lessons about persistence and adaptability, finding ways around obstacles that could not be overcome directly, yet also showing how patience and consistency could eventually move the seemingly immovable. Weather patterns revealed the complex interplay between multiple forces: temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind, combining in ways that produced results far more complex than any single factor could account for. This was a natural analogy for the kind of integrated approach Musashi had developed in his martial practice, where technique, timing, psychology, and awareness all worked together to create outcomes that transcended what any single element could achieve. Even the daily cycles of light and shadow provided insights into the nature of change and continuity. The same landscape could appear completely different under morning mist, afternoon sun, or evening moonlight, yet remained fundamentally itself beneath these surface transformations. This taught Musashi something important about the relationship between essence and appearance, between what changed and what remained constant across all changes. He wrote not only about technique, but about presence, perception, and purpose. He taught that the warrior's mind must be as fluid as water, aware without judgment, and always ready to adapt. This was not merely practical advice, but a complete philosophy of engagement with the world. The warrior, in Musashi's understanding, was not someone who fought for a living, but someone who approached every aspect of existence with the same clarity and purposefulness that even characterized perfect sword work. The act of writing itself became another form of practice for Musashi. Like his other pursuits, it required the same quality of attention he had brought to combat and art. Each word had to be chosen with precision, each sentence crafted to convey not just information, but understanding. The text had to flow like water, yet strike like steel when necessary. It had to be accessible to beginners, while containing depths that would reward years of study. Writing about combat presented unique challenges. How could words capture the immediacy of life and death encounters? How could static text convey the dynamic flow of action and reaction? Musashi solved this by focusing not on the external mechanics of technique, but on the internal states that made technique possible. He wrote about the quality of mind that perceived openings, the kind of presence that remained calm under pressure, the type of awareness that could track multiple variables simultaneously. His descriptions of the 5 elemental approaches were not meant to be memorized as doctrine, but experienced as living principles. A student might read about the water approach dozens of times, but true understanding would come only through years of practice, through countless moments of discovering how to flow around obstacles while maintaining essential direction. The text was a map, not the territory itself, pointing toward experiences that could not be fully communicated through words alone. The writing process also forced Musashi to articulate insights that had previously existed only as intuitive understanding. In combat, he had acted from knowledge too immediate for conscious thought. Now he had to find ways to make this knowledge accessible to others, to translate the wordless wisdom of the body into concepts that could be studied and applied. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his later years, not the development of new techniques, but the communication of principles that transcended technique. His final work, The Book of 5 Rings, is part sword manual, heart meditation. In it, he describes 5 elemental approaches to combat: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. But these are not merely tactics. They are metaphors for ways of seeing the world. Earth is stability, the fundamental grounding that allows all other movement to occur. It represents the basic techniques, the foundation of knowledge upon which everything else is built. But Earth is not static. It shifts with the seasons, erodes and rebuilds, provides the substance from which all life grows. The warrior grounded in Earth is not rigid, but deeply rooted, able to withstand pressure because their foundation is secure. Water is flexibility, the ability to adapt to any container while maintaining essential nature. Water flows around obstacles, finds the path of least resistance, and yet can carve through the hardest stone, given time and persistence. The warrior who embodies water is responsive rather than reactive, able to change tactics without losing sight of objectives, capable of both gentle persistence and overwhelming force. Fire is energy, the explosive power that can transform any situation in an instant. Fire consumes but also purifies, destroys but also creates the conditions for new growth. The warrior who understands fire knows when to strike with overwhelming force and when to withdraw, when to burn bridges and when to preserve them for future use. Wind is the understanding of others, the ability to perceive and adapt to different styles and approaches. Wind can be gentle or destructive, can carry seeds to new ground, or strip leaves from trees. The warrior who masters wind can read opponents not just as technical problems to be solved, but as complete human beings with their own histories, motivations, and limitations. And void, the most mysterious, is the space between thoughts, the awareness that arises when the mind is still. Void is not emptiness but potential, not the absence of something, but the presence of everything in unmanifested form. The warrior who touches void acts not from calculation, but from intuition, not from technique, but from understanding that transcends technique. These 5 approaches were not meant to be used in isolation, but to be integrated into a seamless whole. A single combat might require Earth's stability, water's adaptation, fire's explosive power, wind's understanding, and void's transcendent awareness, sometimes all within the span of a few heartbeats. The master warrior was not someone who had perfected one approach, but someone who could flow between all 5 as circumstances demanded. Musashi spent his last years living in a cave called Raigando, outside of Kumamoto. The cave was not a retreat from the world, but a different kind of engagement with it. Here, surrounded by stone and silence, he could perceive the subtle currents that connected all things. He meditated, wrote, and received a few students who came in search of understanding. These students were not typical followers seeking to learn techniques or gain reputation. They were individuals who had already achieved some measure of mastery in their own right, and who recognized that Musashi offered something beyond conventional teaching. They came not to learn how to fight, but to understand what fighting meant, not to acquire new techniques, but to discover the source from which all techniques emerged. By then, his reputation was well known, but he remained quiet, distant, and focused inward. The famous duels were matters of history. The development of Niiten Achiru was complete. The artistic works spoke for themselves. What remained was the deepest teaching of all, the demonstration of a life lived in complete accordance with one's understanding. He died in 1645, reportedly seated in meditation, his sword at his side. He had never taken a wife. He had never served a lord for long. His victories were many, but his real pursuit was something far less visible. He sought the rhythm beneath the surface, the truth behind each movement, and the stillness that holds all things together. The manner of his death was itself a teaching. To die in meditation, weapons close at hand but not in use, represented the perfect balance he had sought throughout his life. Ready for action but not driven by it, prepared for conflict but not seeking it, present in the moment but not attached to outcomes. His legacy was not measured in the conventional terms of samurai achievement. Land held, battles won, lords served. Instead, it lived in the students he had influenced, the writings he had left behind, and the example he had provided of a life in complete accordance with one's deepest understanding. The techniques of Niiten Ichiru would be passed down through generations, but more important was the spirit behind those techniques, the quality of attention, the commitment to continuous learning, the courage to follow one's own path regardless of social expectations. To walk beside Musashi was to enter a world without comfort or certainty. There were no schedules, no warm meals waiting, no village duties to structure the day. Only the sound of footsteps on the road, the weight of 2 blades at the hip, and the quiet presence of a man whose life was shaped not by the rules of society, but by the unfolding path ahead. The road that carried him was the same road that carried merchants and farmers, pilgrims and officials, bandits and beggars. But for Musashi, it was something more, a teacher that offered lessons in adaptation, endurance, and the art of being present in each moment. Every mile traveled was a form of practice, every encounter a chance to test understanding, every night spent under stars an opportunity to reflect on the day's lessons. This was the way of the Musashi, the warrior's pilgrimage, a tradition that recognized martial arts, not as mere fighting techniques, but as a path of spiritual development. The external journey through the landscapes of Japan was paralleled by an internal journey through the landscapes of consciousness. Each duel fought was also a confrontation with one's own limitations. Each victory a step toward greater understanding, each defeat a teacher more valuable than any triumph. The Japan through which Musashi wandered was itself undergoing this kind of transformation. The old certainties of the Sengoku period were giving way to the new order of the Tokugawa era. Warriors were being transformed into bureaucrats. Battlefield skills were becoming ceremonial arts, and the wild energy of continuous conflict was being channeled into the formal structures of peace. Musashi represented a bridge between these two worlds. A man who had learned war's deepest lessons, but who chose to apply them in the service of understanding rather than conquest. His very existence posed questions about the nature of identity in this changing world. What was a warrior when there were no more wars to fight? What was the purpose of martial skill when society increasingly valued stability over strength? These questions would follow Japan into the centuries of isolation that lay ahead. But for Musashi, they were immediate and personal challenges that shaped every day of his wandering life. The roads he traveled were themselves witnesses to this transformation. Ancient paths that had once carried armies now served merchants and administrators. Castles that had been fortresses became administrative centers. The very landscape seemed to exhale the tension of old conflicts while inhaling the possibility of lasting peace. Through this world in transition, Musashi moved like a living reminder of what was passing away. Not the violence itself, but the profound engagement with life and death that violence had demanded. His students, those few who understood what he truly offered, carried forward not just his techniques, but his approach to existence. They learned to see every moment as a potential teaching, every challenge as an opportunity for growth, every conflict as a chance to discover something previously hidden about themselves and the world around them. This was perhaps his greatest legacy, not the specific methods of two-sword fighting, but the example of a life lived in complete alignment with one's deepest understanding of truth. Now, as we leave the wandering swordsman behind, let your thoughts settle like his did in the forest. Breathe in the stillness and let the dust of the road fade away. The path of the sword master ends here, but the path of the seeker continues, taking new forms, following different trails through the same eternal landscape of human experience. Ahead lies a quieter story, but one shadowed by secrecy and marked by courage of a different kind. We turn now to the hidden Christians of Japan, who clung to belief in a time of silence and fear. Where Musashi's battles were fought in the open, under the wide sky, and witnessed by crowds, theirs were fought in shadows, behind closed doors, in the secret chambers of the heart. Their shrines were not grand, their gatherings were not public, but their faith endured in small, flickering spaces, passed from parent to child, behind closed doors, and under careful watch, a different kind of mastery achieved, through persistence rather than power, through hiding rather than seeking, through the quiet strength of those who refuse to let the light go out, no matter how fierce the darkness that surrounds them. The story of the hidden Christians begins quietly, not in a village or on a battlefield, but in a prayer softly spoken behind closed doors. In the early 1600s, as Tokugawa rule settled over Japan, foreign influences became increasingly unwelcome. Christianity, introduced decades earlier by Portuguese and Spanish missionaries, was one such presence. At first, it had been tolerated in parts of the country. Some lords even converted. Churches were built, crosses were raised, Bibles were read aloud to crowds. For a brief moment, faith found space. But that moment passed. With growing suspicion of foreign powers and a strong desire to preserve order, the Tokugawa shogunate began a long and deliberate effort to erase Christianity from the islands. Missionaries were expelled. Churches were dismantled. Public worship was outlawed. And yet, in quiet corners of Japan, belief remained. The transformation did not happen overnight. In the decades before the ban, Christianity had taken root in ways that surprised even its earliest advocates. Feudal lords like Omura Sumitada and Arima Harunobu had embraced the faith not merely as spiritual guidance, but as a pathway to lucrative trade relationships with Portuguese merchants. Their conversions brought entire domains under Christian influence. Villages that had once marked their seasons with Buddhist festivals now gathered for Christmas masses. Children who had learned to write using classical Chinese characters now traced Latin letters in the sand. In Nagasaki, the transformation was most visible. The port city hummed with foreign voices. Jesuit schools taught European mathematics alongside Christian theology. Local artisans crafted religious art that blended Western iconography with Japanese techniques. Silver crucifixes emerged from workshops that had once produced Buddhist temple ornaments. The city's soundscape changed too. Church bells rang across harbors where temple drums had once marked the hours. Portuguese hymns echoed through streets where only Japanese prayers had been heard. Yet even in these early days of acceptance, there were undercurrents of resistance. Buddhist monasteries watched with growing concern as their congregations dwindled. Shinto priests found their shrines neglected as families turned to foreign gods. Local officials reported strange new customs, noting how Christian converts refused to participate in traditional festivals honoring the emperor's divine ancestry. The seeds of future persecution were already taking root in a soil of cultural tension. The catalyst came in 1597 with the crucifixion of 26 Christians in Nagasaki. This event, known as the San Felipe Incident, marked the beginning of a systematic campaign against the foreign faith. What followed was not merely religious persecution, but a comprehensive effort to purge Japan of all Christian influence. The Tokugawa government, still consolidating power after centuries of civil war, saw Christianity as a threat to their vision of a unified, controllable society. Those who continued to practice their Christian faith did so in secret. They were known as Kakur Kirishiten, or hidden Christians. These were not groups gathering in open defiance, but families and individuals adapting their beliefs to survive. Over time, their traditions changed shape. Public ceremonies vanished. Icons were disguised. Prayers were passed down by memory, often altered slightly to avoid detection. The adaptation required extraordinary ingenuity. Christian families learned to embed their faith within the accepted rhythms of Japanese life. They attended Buddhist temples on designated days, bowing before statues they privately rejected. They participated in Shinto ceremonies when required, moving through the motions while maintaining inner resistance. Their children learned to navigate dual identities, Christian at home, conformist in public. The development of hidden religious objects became an art form born of necessity. Craftsmen who had once openly created Christian artifacts now worked in secret, developing techniques to disguise sacred images. Medals bearing the image of Christ were designed to look like ordinary decorative pendants. Crosses were hidden within the patterns of family crests. Books of Christian prayers were disguised as Buddhist texts, their true contents readable only to those who knew the code. Perhaps most remarkable were the hidden Madonnas, statues of the Virgin Mary disguised as Kannon, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. These figures required extraordinary skill to create. The artist had to craft an image that would satisfy both the Christian devotee and the suspicious official. The Virgin's robes became Kannon's flowing garments. The infant Jesus became a small Buddha. The Western features were subtly altered to appear more Japanese. Yet for those who knew what to look for, the Christian elements remained visible. The way the figure held her hands, the expression on her face, the arrangement of the drapery, all carried coded messages that spoke to the faithful. Imagine entering a modest home on a remote hillside, where nothing outward suggests anything unusual. Perhaps there's a small shrine in the corner, but instead of Buddhist or Shinto symbols, there is a statue of the Virgin Mary disguised as the goddess Kannon. It stands quietly on a shelf, dressed in robes, holding an infant. To the casual observer, it appears local. But to the family who lives here, it is sacred. Inside, the family gathers at night, Doors closed, lamps dimmed. An elder begins to chant in a soft voice, reciting words handed down for generations. The language is a blend of Latin, Portuguese, and Old Japanese, shaped by time and necessity. The children sit still, listening. They do not ask questions. This is not just tradition. It is survival. The prayers themselves tell a story of linguistic evolution under pressure. The original Latin words, Pater noster qui es in celis, became Pataviru nostolu qui vi tensira. The Ave Maria transformed into Abema Santa Maria. Over generations, these phrases were passed down by families who no longer understood their original meaning, but preserved them with religious devotion. The sounds themselves became sacred, divorced from their semantic content, but rich with spiritual significance. Hidden Christians developed their own prayers, known as orasho, which often sounded like Buddhist chants to an outsider. Their faith became an oral tradition, with no printed scriptures and no clergy. Baptisms were performed in secret by lay people. Holidays were marked in silence. Over time, even the meanings of some rituals shifted, blending Christian doctrine with elements of Japanese spirituality. The theological implications of this isolation were profound. Without priests to guide them, without access to official doctrine, the hidden Christians developed their own understanding of Christian teaching. Their theology became a unique fusion, incorporating elements of Buddhist karma, Shinto animism, and Christian salvation. They maintained beliefs about Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, but these figures took on characteristics that would have been foreign to European Christians. Their calendar became a complex weaving of Christian and Japanese observances. Christmas was celebrated quietly, often coinciding with winter solstice festivals. Easter was marked by subtle changes in family behavior, perhaps the sharing of special foods or the lighting of particular candles. Saints' days were remembered through small household rituals that appeared to outsiders as ordinary family customs. The structure of their communities reflected their precarious position. Unlike the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church, hidden Christian communities operated as networks of families bound by shared risk. Leadership passed not through formal ordination, but through knowledge and trust. The most respected members were those who could remember the most prayers, who could perform the most rituals, who could maintain the traditions with the greatest accuracy. Children born into these communities faced unique challenges. They had to be old enough to understand the gravity of secrecy before they could be fully initiated into the family's true faith. Parents watched their children carefully, looking for signs of trustworthiness, of emotional maturity, of the ability to maintain the careful balance between inner belief and outer conformity. The fear of discovery was constant. Authorities used a test known as the Fumi-e, in which villagers were ordered to step on images of Christ or the Virgin Mary. Refusing to do so marked a person as a believer and often led to arrest or worse. Families learned to pass these tests. Some stepped on the images while praying silently. Others taught their children how to move their feet with just enough pressure to avoid suspicion. Survival meant compromise. The Fumi-e ceremony became a traumatic ritual that revealed the psychological toll of hidden faith. Imagine standing in a line with your neighbors, approaching a wooden board bearing the image of Christ's face. The bronze has been worn smooth by countless feet, the features barely visible after decades of use. The official watches your expression, looking for hesitation, for the telltale signs of internal conflict. You know that your faith teaches you to revere this image, yet you also know that your family's survival depends on your ability to desecrate it. Some families developed elaborate justifications for their actions. They told themselves that God would understand their circumstances, that the act was performed by their feet while their hearts remained pure. Others created complex theological explanations, arguing that the image itself was not divine, that stepping on it was not true sacrilege. These mental gymnastics were necessary for psychological survival, ways of preserving both faith and life in an impossible situation. The testing was not limited to the fumii. Authorities developed increasingly sophisticated methods of detection. They monitored burial practices, looking for families who interred their dead in Christian fashion. They tracked the movement of suspected believers, noting who visited whom and when. They infiltrated communities with informants, creating an atmosphere of constant suspicion. Village officials played a crucial role in this system of surveillance. These men, often chosen from local families, found themselves in an impossible position. They were expected to identify and report Christians among their neighbors, people they had known since childhood. Some officials were zealous in their pursuit, eager to prove their loyalty to the government. Others turned a blind eye, finding ways to protect their communities while maintaining the appearance of compliance. The psychological impact of this surveillance extended far beyond the hidden Christians themselves. Entire communities lived under the weight of suspicion. Neighbors watched neighbors, looking for signs of unusual behavior. Children learned to be careful with their words, never knowing who might be listening. The social fabric of rural Japan was transformed by this climate of fear and mistrust. Entire communities vanished from official records, choosing instead to scatter across remote islands or rugged coastlines. In places like the Goto Islands or the hidden valleys of Nagasaki, faith continued in soft voices and hidden symbols. Occasionally, word would spread of a Christian family discovered, and there would be interrogations, imprisonments, and silence. But the belief endured. The geography of hidden Christianity tells its own story. The communities that survived were those that could find refuge in Japan's most isolated places. On the Goto Islands, families built their lives on remote beaches, sustaining themselves through fishing and farming. In the mountains of Kyushu, they established settlements in valleys, so remote that government officials rarely ventured there. On the Amakusa Islands, they created networks of support that stretched across the water, connecting scattered communities through secret channels of communication. These locations were chosen not just for their isolation, but for their strategic advantages. Many were positioned along traditional smuggling routes, places where contraband had moved for centuries. Others were in areas where the terrain made surveillance difficult, where lookouts could spot approaching officials from miles away. The hidden Christians learned to read the landscape like a text, understanding which paths were safe, which seasons offered the best concealment, which neighbors could be trusted. Their survival techniques became increasingly sophisticated over time. They developed coded languages for discussing religious matters, ways of speaking that would sound innocent to outsiders but carry deep meaning for the initiated. They created elaborate systems of signals, using everything from the arrangement of fishing nets to the patterns of laundry hanging on lines to communicate important information. The women of these communities played particularly crucial roles. In a society where women's movements were less closely monitored than men's, they became the primary carriers of religious knowledge. Mothers taught prayers to their children, passing down not just the words, but the proper intonation, the correct gestures, the subtle variations that marked their particular tradition. Women organized the secret gatherings, managed the hidden religious objects, and maintained the networks that connected scattered believers. Their roles extended beyond mere preservation. As the generations passed and the original Christian teachings became increasingly distant, it was often the women who adapted the traditions to new circumstances. They incorporated elements of Japanese folk religion when necessary, modified rituals to fit changing social conditions, and found ways to maintain spiritual meaning even as the external forms evolved. The children of hidden Christian families grew up with a unique understanding of truth and secrecy. They learned that there were things that could be said and things that could not, people who could be trusted and people who could not. They developed an acute sensitivity to social dynamics, an ability to read the unspoken currents that flowed beneath the surface of everyday interactions. This education in duplicity had profound effects on their psychological development. They learned to compartmentalize their identities, to maintain parallel versions of themselves for different audiences. They became skilled at detecting deception in others, at reading the subtle signs that might indicate friend or foe. These skills served them well in their dangerous circumstances, but they also created internal tensions that lasted throughout their lives. The hidden Christians developed their own forms of art and literature. Unable to create openly Christian works, they found ways to embed their beliefs in apparently secular creations. Poems that seemed to celebrate the beauty of nature carried hidden references to biblical stories. Songs that appeared to be simple folk tunes contained coded prayers. Even cooking became a form of religious expression, with special foods prepared for hidden holidays, recipes that carried spiritual significance passed down through generations. Their music evolved in particularly interesting ways. Christian hymns were adapted to sound like traditional Japanese songs, their melodies modified to fit the pentatonic scale, their rhythms adjusted to match familiar folk patterns. The words were often completely transformed, with Christian concepts expressed through Buddhist or Shinto imagery. Yet somehow, the spiritual essence of the original music survived these transformations. For nearly 2.5 centuries, these hidden Christians lived without outside contact. No priests arrived, no letters came. Yet the line of tradition held. Parents taught their children. Elders kept the stories alive. And always, the risk remained. The isolation was not merely physical, but spiritual. These communities had to maintain their faith without the institutional support that Christianity had always provided. They had no bishops to resolve theological disputes, no seminaries to train leaders, no Vatican to provide guidance on doctrinal matters. They were essentially inventing their own form of Christianity, one that would have been barely recognizable to their European coreligionists. This spiritual isolation led to remarkable innovations. They developed their own forms of confession, with family members taking turns admitting their sins to each other. They created substitute sacraments, using local materials to approximate the rituals they remembered from the past. They established their own calendar of saints, often incorporating figures from Japanese history, who they believed embodied Christian virtues. Their theological development followed unique paths. The concept of martyrdom, so central to early Christian thought, became deeply embedded in their spiritual understanding. They saw themselves as living martyrs, daily sacrificing their safety for their faith. This perspective gave them a powerful sense of purpose and helped them endure the psychological pressures of their situation. The relationship between generations became particularly complex. Elderly members of the community carried the burden of authentic memory, the responsibility of preserving traditions that grew more distant with each passing year. Middle-aged adults managed the practical aspects of survival, maintaining the delicate balance between concealment and community. Young people faced the challenge of inheriting a faith they had never seen practiced openly, beliefs that had been shaped by centuries of adaptation and compromise. As the Tokugawa period wore on, the hidden Christians developed increasingly sophisticated methods of maintaining their traditions. They created elaborate systems of religious education, with different families responsible for preserving different aspects of the faith. One family might specialize in maintaining the prayers, another in preserving the stories, a third in keeping the calendar of observances. They also developed complex inheritance systems, ensuring that religious knowledge would not be lost if particular family lines died out. Important prayers and rituals were taught to multiple people, creating redundancy that protected against the loss of crucial information. Religious objects were carefully maintained and secretly passed down, often with elaborate protocols governing their care and use. The hidden Christians also faced the challenge of maintaining genetic diversity within their small, isolated communities. They developed marriage networks that stretched across considerable distances, connecting hidden Christian families throughout Western Japan. These marriages served both practical and spiritual purposes, strengthening the bonds between communities while ensuring that their children would not suffer from the effects of inbreeding. The wedding ceremonies of hidden Christians became elaborate affairs that balanced the need for celebration with the requirement for secrecy. They were typically held at night in remote locations, with only the most trusted family members in attendance. The ceremonies themselves blended Christian traditions with Japanese customs, creating unique rituals that would have been foreign to both cultures in their pure forms. Their burial practices revealed the depth of their theological innovation. Unable to use Christian cemeteries or openly Christian funeral rites, they developed their own ways of honoring their dead. They created secret burial grounds in remote locations, often marked with stones that carried hidden Christian symbols. They developed funeral prayers that sounded like Buddhist chants, but carried Christian meaning. They established elaborate protocols for mourning that allowed them to grieve according to their faith while maintaining the appearance of conformity. The hidden Christians also had to navigate the complex world of Japanese folk religion. They found ways to participate in local festivals and ceremonies while maintaining their private beliefs. They learned to interpret Shinto rituals through Christian lenses, finding Christian meaning in apparently pagan practices. They developed theological explanations for their participation in Buddhist ceremonies, justifying their actions through complex religious reasoning. During the annual Obon festival, when communities gathered to honor their ancestors, hidden Christian families faced particularly complex challenges. The festival required active participation in Buddhist rituals, the burning of incense, the offering of food to ancestral spirits. Yet for families who believed in Christian concepts of afterlife and salvation, these practices created profound spiritual conflict. Some developed elaborate internal narratives, telling themselves they were honoring their ancestors as people rather than as spirits, that they were participating in community solidarity rather than religious worship. Others found ways to transform the rituals, silently dedicating their offerings to Christian saints or martyrs while appearing to follow Buddhist customs. The New Year celebrations presented similar challenges. The traditional visiting of Shinto shrines, the purchase of protective amulets, the prayers for prosperity and health, all required public displays of non-Christian faith. Hidden Christian families learned to navigate these requirements while maintaining their private beliefs. They would visit the shrines as required, but they would pray silently to their Christian God instead of to the Shinto deities. They would purchase the amulets, but would never use them, instead relying on hidden Christian medallions for spiritual protection. Their relationship with the natural world was profoundly shaped by their circumstances. Living in isolated, often harsh environments, they developed a deep appreciation for the spiritual significance of the landscape around them. They found sacred meaning in remote beaches, hidden valleys, and mountain peaks that provided them with refuge. They developed their own forms of nature worship that blended Christian theology with Japanese animism. The ocean held particular significance for hidden Christian communities on the islands. They saw in its vastness a reflection of God's infinite nature, in its storms a manifestation of divine power, in its calm moments a promise of peace. They developed prayers specifically for times of fishing, invoking Christian protection, while using language that would sound like traditional fishermen's chants to any observer. The rhythm of the tides became incorporated into their prayer cycles, with certain devotions reserved for high tide, others for low tide, creating a spiritual calendar that matched the natural rhythms of their environment. Mountains, too, became sacred spaces in their hidden geography. The peaks that surrounded their communities were not just physical barriers protecting them from discovery, but spiritual landmarks that marked their connection to the divine. They developed pilgrimages to remote mountain shrines, ostensibly Buddhist or Shinto destinations, but which they invested with Christian meaning. The act of climbing became a form of prayer, the physical struggle a representation of spiritual striving, the view from the summit a glimpse of heaven. The seasonal rhythms of their lives were structured around both agricultural necessities and hidden religious observances. They learned to time their secret gatherings to coincide with natural events that would provide cover for their activities. They developed religious calendars that matched the cycles of farming and fishing, ensuring that their spiritual practices would not interfere with their survival activities. Spring planting season became particularly significant for hidden Christian communities. The act of placing seeds in the ground, trusting that they would grow despite being buried in darkness, became a powerful metaphor for their own faith. They developed prayers for planting that spoke of Christian hope and resurrection, while using agricultural language that would seem innocent to observers. The green shoots that emerged from the soil were seen as symbols of their own survival, evidence that life could flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. Harvest time brought its own spiritual significance. The gathering of crops was not just an economic necessity, but a religious celebration, a time to give thanks for God's provision, while maintaining the appearance of traditional Japanese agricultural customs. They developed harvest prayers that praised Christian providence, while using language that would sound like conventional farmers' thanksgiving. The storage of grain for winter became a spiritual act, a demonstration of faith in God's continued protection through the lean months ahead. The hidden Christians also developed sophisticated systems of spiritual mentorship and guidance. In the absence of formal clergy, they created informal networks of religious teachers and counselors. Elderly members of the community, who had preserved the most complete knowledge of prayers and rituals, became highly respected figures, sought out for advice on spiritual matters. These informal leaders had to be extraordinarily careful, providing guidance and comfort while never explicitly acknowledging their religious authority. The process of choosing these informal leaders was itself a complex social negotiation. Communities had to identify individuals who possessed not just religious knowledge, but also the psychological strength to carry the burden of spiritual leadership under dangerous circumstances. They needed people who could provide comfort to the doubting, strength to the wavering, and wisdom to the confused, all while maintaining the facade of ordinary village life. These informal spiritual leaders developed sophisticated techniques for providing religious guidance without explicitly discussing religious matters. They learned to speak in metaphors and parables, to offer advice through seemingly secular conversations about farming, fishing, or family life. They became masters of the meaningful glance, the subtle gesture, the carefully chosen word that could convey spiritual significance while maintaining plausible deniability. The hidden Christians also had to develop their own forms of religious discipline and correction. In traditional Christian communities, the church provided mechanisms for addressing spiritual failures and moral lapses. Hidden Christian communities had to create their own systems for maintaining religious standards without formal authority structures. They developed subtle forms of social pressure and spiritual encouragement that could guide behavior while respecting the dangerous circumstances in which they lived. Their approach to sin and forgiveness was particularly complex. They maintained belief in Christian concepts of sin and redemption, but they had to adapt these concepts to their circumstances. The sign of participating in non-Christian rituals, for example, was understood differently than it might have been in other Christian contexts. They developed elaborate theological justifications for actions that were necessary for survival, creating a moral framework that could accommodate the compromises required by their situation. The hidden Christians also faced unique challenges in maintaining their sense of Christian identity across generations. Children born into these communities had never seen Christianity practiced openly, had never experienced the public rituals and community celebrations that were central to Christian life elsewhere. They had to develop their religious identity based entirely on private, secret practices, on whispered prayers and hidden symbols. This challenge was particularly acute for young adults who were beginning to question the traditions they had inherited. Without access to formal religious education, without the ability to openly discuss their beliefs, they had to develop their faith through personal reflection and family guidance. Parents had to find ways to address their children's spiritual questions while maintaining the secrecy that was essential for survival. The hidden Christians developed elaborate coming-of-age rituals that marked the transition from childhood to full participation in the secret faith. These ceremonies were carefully designed to be invisible to outsiders while carrying deep meaning for the community. They often involved the formal transmission of religious knowledge that had been carefully guarded, the revelation of family secrets that had been preserved for generations, and the assumption of new responsibilities for maintaining the community's spiritual life. The economic aspects of hidden Christian life were also shaped by their religious circumstances. They had to find ways to support their communities without attracting attention, to maintain their standard of living without displaying wealth that might invite scrutiny. They developed networks of mutual support that operated through seemingly ordinary business relationships, creating systems of economic cooperation that served both practical and spiritual purposes. Their trading relationships often extended across considerable distances, connecting hidden Christian communities throughout Western Japan. These networks served multiple purposes. They provided economic opportunities, they facilitated communication between scattered communities, and they offered mechanisms for sharing resources and knowledge. A merchant who traveled between hidden Christian communities might carry not just goods, but also news, prayers, and even religious objects that helped maintain the connections between isolated groups. The hidden Christians also had to navigate the complex world of taxation and official documentation. They had to maintain the appearance of being ordinary Japanese subjects while secretly organizing their lives around different principles. They learned to present themselves to officials as model citizens, participating in all required activities, paying all necessary taxes, and avoiding any behavior that might attract unwanted attention. Their relationship with money itself was complicated by their religious beliefs. They maintained Christian teachings about charity and mutual support, but they had to implement these principles in ways that would not be visible to observers. They developed systems of secret charity, ways of helping community members in need without creating obvious patterns of unusual generosity. They learned to share resources through seemingly ordinary transactions, to provide support through networks of reciprocal obligation that looked like normal social relationships. The hidden Christians also developed unique approaches to conflict resolution. In traditional Christian communities, disputes were often resolved through church mediation or formal religious processes. Hidden Christian communities had to develop their own methods for addressing conflicts while maintaining their secrecy. They created informal systems of mediation and arbitration that drew on Christian principles of forgiveness and reconciliation, but operated through seemingly secular processes. Their approach to justice was particularly complex. They had to balance their Christian beliefs about forgiveness and redemption with the practical necessities of maintaining community security. They developed sophisticated methods for addressing serious violations of community trust, ways of protecting themselves from potential betrayers while maintaining their commitment to Christian mercy and compassion. It was not until the mid-19th century, when Japan reopened to the world and religious freedom slowly returned, that the presence of the hidden Christians became known once more. When Catholic missionaries arrived again in Nagasaki in the 1860s, they were approached by local villagers who spoke of ancient prayers and long-lost sacraments. The priests were astonished. After all that time, there were still families who remembered. The rediscovery of the hidden Christians was one of the most remarkable events in the history of religious persecution. Father Bernard Petichin, a French priest who had just completed the construction of Aura Church in Nagasaki, was approached by a group of Japanese who whispered that they shared his faith. They spoke of Maria-sama, of prayers passed down through generations, of secret practices maintained for centuries. The moment of revelation was fraught with emotion and uncertainty. The hidden Christians had to overcome not just their fear of discovery, but their uncertainty about whether these new foreign priests represented the same faith they had preserved. Their Christianity had evolved in isolation, developing characteristics that were uniquely Japanese. They had to determine whether their adaptations were still authentically Christian, whether their compromises had somehow corrupted their faith. The missionaries, for their part, had to grapple with the discovery of a form of Christianity that was almost unrecognizable. The prayers were in archaic languages. The rituals were unfamiliar. The theological concepts had been modified by centuries of isolation. They had to decide whether to embrace these communities as fellow Christians or to require them to abandon their traditional practices in favor of Orthodox Catholic doctrine. Some chose to rejoin the formal Catholic Church. Others remained apart, continuing their isolated traditions, unsure of how much had changed or how much had stayed the same. To this day, small communities still preserve those hidden rites, not in defiance, but as a quiet echo of endurance. The decision of whether to join the official church or remain independent created deep divisions within hidden Christian communities. Families that had maintained their faith together for centuries found themselves split by theological and practical considerations. Some argued that their duty was to return to the mainstream church, to reconnect with the global Christian community from which they had been separated. Others contended that their unique traditions were precious in their own right, that their form of Christianity was just as valid as any other. These debates revealed the extent to which the hidden Christians had developed their own sense of religious identity. They were not simply Japanese people who happened to believe in Christianity. They were members of a unique religious tradition that had evolved in isolation. Their practices, their beliefs, their very sense of what it meant to be Christian had been shaped by centuries of adaptation and survival. The communities that chose to remain independent faced new challenges. They had to maintain their traditions in a world that was rapidly modernizing, where the old patterns of rural life were being disrupted by industrialization and urbanization. They had to preserve their faith in the face of new forms of skepticism and indifference, where the threat was not persecution, but neglect. Some of these communities have survived to the present day. They continue to practice their unique form of Christianity, maintaining traditions that date back to the earliest days of the faith in Japan. They are living bridges to a past that might otherwise have been lost, preserving not just religious practices, but entire ways of life that have vanished elsewhere. Their story is not one of violence or uprising, but of patient resilience. There are no monuments or great battles to mark their path. Only small homes, hidden statues, and words whispered in the dark. The legacy of the hidden Christians extends far beyond their religious significance. Their story illuminates the complex dynamics of cultural survival under extreme pressure. They developed strategies for maintaining identity while appearing to conform, for preserving tradition while adapting to changing circumstances, for maintaining community while dispersing geographically. These strategies have relevance for understanding how other marginalized groups have survived periods of persecution and oppression. Their experience also reveals the remarkable adaptability of religious faith. Christianity, a religion that originated in the Middle East and was shaped by Mediterranean and European cultures, was transformed by the hidden Christians into something that could survive in the specific conditions of Tokugawa Japan. They prove that faith can maintain its essential character while adapting its external forms to radically different circumstances. The hidden Christians also demonstrated the power of oral tradition in preserving cultural knowledge. Without books, without formal institutions, without official support, they managed to maintain complex religious traditions for centuries. Their success challenges modern assumptions about the need for written records and formal education in preserving cultural heritage. Their story also highlights the role of women in maintaining religious traditions. In a society where women's public roles were severely restricted, the hidden Christian women found ways to exercise spiritual leadership and cultural authority. They became the primary preservers of religious knowledge, the organizers of secret communities, the teachers of future generations. Their example challenges conventional narratives about women's roles in traditional Japanese society. The hidden Christians' experience with surveillance and social control provides insights into the dynamics of authoritarian rule. They learn to navigate systems of oppression, to maintain private beliefs while conforming publicly, to create spaces of freedom within structures of control. Their strategies for survival offer lessons for understanding how individuals and communities can maintain their integrity under oppressive circumstances. Their story also reveals the complex relationship between center and periphery in Japanese society. The hidden Christians survived primarily in remote, marginal areas, places that were beyond the reach of central authority. Their experience illustrates how geographic isolation could provide protection from political and cultural pressures, how the edges of society could become spaces of alternative possibility. As we leave their world behind, imagine once more the flicker of candlelight on a smooth wooden floor, the hush of a room where every breath is careful, the passing of belief from hand to hand, voice to voice, without ever being written down. Picture the weathered faces of elderly women reciting prayers in languages they no longer fully understand, their voices carrying the weight of centuries. See the careful movements of families arranging their hidden shrines, positioning sacred objects that must appear ordinary to casual observers. Think of the children growing up in these communities, learning to navigate the complex boundary between public conformity and private faith. Consider the moments of terror when officials arrived unexpectedly, when the careful balance between concealment and community was threatened. Imagine the relief of safe gatherings, the precious moments when masks could be dropped and faith could be expressed openly, if only for a few hours. The hidden Christians created a world within a world, a secret society that existed in the spaces between official recognition and complete disappearance. They proved that faith could survive without institutions, that tradition could persist without official support, that community could exist without public acknowledgement. Their story is one of the most remarkable examples of cultural survival in human history, a testament to the power of belief to transcend even the most determined efforts at suppression. And now, as we move deeper into the heart of Tokugawa society, we turn to a place where silence was not the sound of fear, but the sound of power. Let us now enter the stone corridors and sliding screens of an Edo castle. Here, robes rustled in quiet halls. Messages were sent with fans. And every movement, every word unspoken, was part of a delicate game played behind doors that few were ever allowed to open. In these halls, where the hidden Christians' whispered prayers would have meant death, other forms of hidden knowledge flourished. Here, in the very center of the system that had driven faith underground, a different kind of secrecy thrived. Here, power itself learned to speak in shadows, to move through suggestion rather than declaration, to rule through the careful orchestration of what was never said aloud. High above the busy streets of Edo, beyond the markets and wooden bridges, rose the broad, layered rooftops of the Tokugawa shogunate's most imposing structures. Edo Castle was not only the physical center of Japan's power, it was also a symbol of order, precision, and quiet control. To step into this space was to enter another world. The noise of the city faded. The stone foundations were cooled beneath the feet. Gravel paths were swept clean of every fallen leaf. And inside, silence was not just preferred. It was expected. The approach to the castle itself was designed to humble. Visitors passed through a series of gates, each one more heavily guarded than the last. The first gate, the Otamen, stood broad and imposing, its wooden timbers reinforced with iron. Here, samurai guards examined papers with meticulous care, their eyes trained to spot the slightest irregularity in seals or signatures. The second gate required a sharp turn, forcing visitors to slow their pace and present themselves again. By the third gate, the Nakamun, even the most confident lord would find his stride measured, his voice lowered. The castle's defensive design was subtle but unmistakable. The paths did not run straight, but curved and twisted, creating natural choke points where defenders could observe newcomers from hidden positions. Stone walls rose in carefully calculated angles, their surfaces too smooth to climb, yet appearing almost natural in their placement. Moats reflected the sky, their dark water hiding the depth beneath. Even the placement of trees was strategic, offering shade and beauty while blocking certain sightlines and creating natural barriers. The interior of the castle was a world made of soft textures and subtle cues. Tatami mats lined the floors, their woven surface offering both comfort and constraint. Each mat was precisely measured, exactly 3 feet by 6 feet, and their arrangement determined the hierarchy of any gathering. A room of 8 mats was modest, suitable for minor officials. A room of 30 mats or more signaled the presence of true authority. The edges of the mats were bound with silk brocade, and the quality of this binding, its color and pattern, spoke volumes about the status of those who regularly used the space. Shoshi screens divided the rooms, allowing light to pass through softly while muffling sound. These screens were works of art in themselves, their wooden frames joined without nails, using techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen. The paper that covered them was made from mulberry bark, treated and stretched until it became translucent yet strong. In winter, the screens might be backed with silk for additional warmth, and in summer, they could be removed entirely to allow breezes to flow through the structure. Paper lanterns gave off a steady, warm glow. The scent of sandalwood sometimes drifted through the halls, carried by incense kept burning near private altars or meeting spaces. These shrines were present in nearly every significant room, honoring ancestors and the kami that protected the Tokugawa line. The incense was imported from distant lands, its quality another marker of the castle's wealth and reach. Power here did not announce itself. There were no loud speeches, no grand gestures. Instead, authority moved quietly, through ritual and careful etiquette. A lord's status was marked not by shouting orders, but by how many mats one sat above another, how many steps a retainer took before being allowed to speak, and how far one had to kneel from the center of the room. The architecture itself reinforced these hierarchies. Doorways were built at different heights, so that those of lower rank would naturally bow their heads when entering certain rooms. The most important chambers featured raised platforms, where high-ranking officials could sit, while others remained on the lower level. Even the pillars that supported the roof were arranged to create natural zones of importance, with the area near the central pillar being reserved for the highest-ranking person present. Conversations were measured, often indirect. Important messages could be delivered through the positioning of a folding fan, or the arrangement of teacups. A fan held at the waist might suggest patience, while one placed on the floor could indicate submission. Teacups arranged in a perfect line showed respect and order, while a single cup turned slightly askew might hint at discord or concern. Even a slight pause in speech, or the angle of one's bow, could carry meaning. Here, misunderstandings were not just embarrassing. They could be dangerous. The language spoken within the castle was itself a form of art. Kigo, the system of honorific speech, reached its most refined form in these halls. A single concept might be expressed in dozens of different ways, each variation precisely calibrated to the relationship between speaker and listener. To address the shogun directly was almost unthinkable. Instead, one spoke to the air beside his ear, using phrases that meant, "if it please the heavens," or "should the winds carry my words favorably." Even silence had its own vocabulary, with different types of pauses meaning different things. The daily rhythm of the castle was governed by a complex system of bells and drums, though these were sounded softly, more felt than heard. The hour of the rabbit, just after dawn, marked the beginning of official business. The hour of the horse at midday brought the main meal and a brief respite. The hour of the cock in the evening signaled the time for reports and final decisions. Each hour was further divided into smaller increments, marked by the burning of incense sticks or the movement of shadows across specially placed stones. The women of the castle, though often unseen in historical records, were part of this system too. Some came from noble families, sent as political symbols. Others served within the joku, the inner chambers reserved for the shogun's wives, concubines, and female attendants. This world, hidden behind additional screens and guarded entrances, was governed by its own hierarchy and subtle politics. The joku was perhaps the most complex social structure within the castle. Here, women from the highest noble families lived alongside daughters of minor samurai, each position carefully defined and jealously guarded. The shogun's official wife, the Mide Dekoro, held supreme authority among the women, but beneath her were layers of rank that determined everything from the color of one's obi to the type of sake served at meals. The okatanaishi, or side wives, enjoyed prestige but always remained secondary. The azoba, personal attendants, wielded influence through their proximity to power, but had to navigate carefully to avoid the jealousy of higher-ranking women. Within these chambers, status determined everything from the color of one's kimono to the way a servant entered a room. The silk for the highest-ranking women's garments was woven with gold thread, its patterns incorporating symbols of the Tokugawa family. The colors followed strict seasonal rules: pale pink for spring, deep blue for summer, russet for autumn, and white for winter. But even within these constraints, subtle variations in shade and pattern could signal alliances, rivalries, or messages that men would never hear. Daily life was highly structured. Meals were served with ritual precision. Letters were composed with layered meaning. Even a simple greeting had to follow the exact form, spoken in a soft, controlled voice. The women of the joku developed their own forms of communication, using the arrangement of flowers, the folding of letters, and even the way they walked to convey information. A woman who entered a room with her hands folded just so might be signaling her support for a particular faction, while another who let her sleeve trail slightly might be indicating her availability for alliance. The education of these women was extensive and sophisticated. They learned not only the traditional arts of calligraphy, poetry, and music, but also the subtleties of politics and diplomacy. Many could read Chinese classical texts, compose poetry in both Japanese and Chinese styles, and perform on multiple instruments. Some became scholars in their own right, though their learning was rarely acknowledged in public records. They maintained correspondence with women in other domains, creating networks of information that sometimes proved as valuable as any official intelligence. The tea ceremony was one of the clearest examples of this world's philosophy. Every gesture, from the folding of a cloth to the turning of a bowl, was deliberate. Each movement was slow, almost meditative. The host and guest exchanged no unnecessary words. Instead, the ritual became its own language, filled with unspoken understanding and mutual respect. But the tea ceremony within the castle was different from that practiced in the outside world. Here, the selection of tea implements could indicate political alliances. A tea master might choose a particular style of bowl to honor a visiting daimyo's region, or select a hanging scroll with calligraphy that contained subtle references to current events. The very tea used might carry meaning. Tea from Uji suggested tradition and stability, while tea from newer gardens might hint at innovation or change. The tea house within the castle grounds was designed to embody the principles of wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of imperfection and impermanence. Its rough wooden posts and deliberately asymmetrical design created a space where, theoretically, all participants were equal. Yet even here, hierarchy persisted. The order in which guests entered, the position where they sat, the way they held their tea bowls, all reflected their status. The tea master, usually a man of lower social rank, was the only person who could direct the movements of great lords during the ceremony. But this authority existed only within the tea house, and only for the duration of the ritual. Guards patrolled the outer gates with steady steps, but inside the castle, violence was not physical, it was political. An insult could come wrapped in politeness. A dismissal could be delivered with a smile, and the most dangerous blade was often a whispered rumor. passed along in low voices behind closed doors. The guards themselves were part of an elaborate system of security that relied more on observation than on force. The castle employed dozens of metsuk, official inspectors, whose job was to watch and report on everyone else. These men dressed like ordinary retainers, but possessed extraordinary authority to investigate any suspicious behavior. They maintained detailed records of who spoke to who received gifts, who seemed to be spending beyond their means. Their reports went directly to the shogun's most trusted advisors, bypassing the normal chains of command. More subtle still were the Onawaban, the shogun's personal intelligence network. These men and women were trained in the arts of stealth and disguise, able to move through the castle undetected and gather information that even the metsuk could not obtain. They might appear as servants, gardeners, or craftsmen, but their real purpose was to ensure the shogun's safety and to identify potential threats before they could mature into actual dangers. The shogun himself rarely appeared in public. When he did, it was brief and carefully staged. Most days, he remained in private chambers, surrounded by advisors and screens. His orders were passed down through ranks of retainers, each carefully chosen, each sworn to loyalty. The shogun's daily routine was itself a form of theater. He rose before dawn and spent the first hour of each day in meditation and prayer at the family shrine. His breakfast was prepared by cooks who had been with the family for generations, and every dish was tasted by a designated retainer before being served. The shogun's clothing was selected by attendants who understood the political significance of every choice. The pattern of his kimono might reference a season, a classical poem, or a current event that required the shogun's subtle commentary. His meetings were choreographed with military precision. Advisors arrived in strict order of precedence, each having been briefed on the topics to be discussed and the expected outcomes. The shogun rarely spoke directly to anyone below the rank of senior counselor, instead directing his comments to the air or to his fan, leaving others to interpret his meaning. When he did speak, his words were recorded by scribes who captured not only what he said, but how he said it, including pauses, changes in tone, and even the direction of his gaze. Visitors to the castle were not given free movement. Instead, they were guided through designated pathways, their shoes removed, their pace regulated. Only a few were permitted beyond the outer rooms. Fewer still reached the inner sanctums where real decisions were made. The process of visiting the castle was itself a form of political theater. Requests for audiences had to be submitted months in advance, accompanied by gifts appropriate to the visitor's rank and the nature of their business. The gifts were examined not only for their quality, but for their symbolic meaning. A lord who brought a sword might be hinting at military matters, while one who offered a scroll of poetry might be suggesting cultural exchange. Even the timing of the visit carried meaning. Arriving during cherry blossom season suggested hope and renewal, while a visit during autumn might indicate resignation or decline. The routes through the castle were carefully planned to impress and intimidate. Visitors passed through gardens where every stone had been placed with intention, where the sound of water over rocks created a sense of natural peace that contrasted with the rigid formality of the buildings. They walked through corridors lined with screens painted by the greatest artists of the age, their images chosen to reflect the power and culture of the Tokugawa line. The final approach to the audience chamber took visitors through a series of increasingly elaborate rooms, each one more impressive than the last, until they reached the presence of the shogun himself. Even time within the castle moved differently. The days were not broken by bells or clocks, but by rituals. Morning meetings, noon meals, evening reports. Each hour shaped by what was expected, not what was felt. The calendar within the castle followed not only the lunar months, but also a complex system of auspicious and inauspicious days. Important decisions were postponed until the stars aligned favorably, and certain days were reserved for specific types of activities. The shogun's marriage had been planned years in advance to coincide with the most favorable celestial conditions, and even routine matters like the promotion of retainers were timed to match the movements of the heavens. The castle's library contained works on astronomy, astrology, and divination that were consulted regularly by the shogun's advisors. These texts, many of them imported from China or copied by Japanese scholars, provided the intellectual framework for understanding the proper timing of political actions. The castle employed its own astronomers, who tracked the movements of planets and stars, providing daily reports on the cosmic influences that might affect the shogun's decisions. Servants moved with soft steps, often barefoot or wearing socks to muffle sound. They memorized routes through the hallways to avoid crossing paths or interrupting higher officials. If they spoke, it was in hushed tones, always with their gaze lowered. The servants within the castle were themselves part of a complex hierarchy. At the bottom were the ashigaru, foot soldiers who performed menial tasks and guard duties. Above them were the chugen, personal attendants who served specific lords or officials. The highest-ranking servants were the kosho, young men from samurai families who served as pages and were being groomed for higher positions. Each level had its own uniforms, its own privileges, and its own codes of behavior. Training to serve in the castle took years. New servants were assigned to veterans who taught them not only the practical skills of their duties, but also the subtle arts of observation and discretion. They learned to read the moods of their masters from the smallest gestures, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, and to communicate with each other through glances and subtle movements. The best servants became almost invisible, present when needed, but never obtrusive, silent but always alert. The castle's kitchens were marvels of organization and efficiency. Food was prepared according to strict protocols that ensured not only its quality, but its safety. Every ingredient was inspected multiple times, and the preparation of each dish was overseen by cooks who had sworn oaths of loyalty to the Tokugawa family. The meals served to the shogun and his family were elaborate affairs, with dozens of small dishes arranged according to aesthetic principles that rivaled the finest art. Even the chopsticks were works of art, carved from rare woods and decorated with lacquer that took months to apply properly. Despite all this stillness, the castle was not lifeless. It breathed in its own rhythm, slow and deliberate. Flowers were arranged each day in new patterns. Calligraphy scrolls were changed to reflect the season. The light shifted across polished wood as the sun moved through the sky. The gardens within the castle grounds were masterpieces of landscape design, each one planned to provide a different emotional experience. The main garden, visible from the shogun's private chambers, was designed to represent the ideal of natural harmony. Its artificial hills and carefully placed stones created the illusion of a natural landscape, while its streams and ponds reflected the changing sky. The garden changed with the seasons, its cherry trees blooming in spring, its maples turning brilliant red in autumn, its snow-covered branches creating patterns of black and white in winter. Smaller gardens throughout the castle served specific purposes. The tea garden was designed to promote contemplation, and peace, its stepping stones and lanterns, creating a path that led visitors away from worldly concerns. The moon viewing garden was built to frame the full moon during autumn festivals. Its elevated platform and carefully pruned trees, creating a natural telescope for observing the night sky. Even the vegetable gardens, hidden behind screens near the kitchens, were arranged with aesthetic considerations, their neat rows and seasonal plantings creating their own form of beauty. The castle's art collection was vast and carefully curated. The shogun's private chambers contained screens and scrolls by the greatest masters of the age, their images chosen to reflect the seasons and the political climate. During times of peace, the screens might feature pastoral scenes of farmers at work or scholars at study. During times of tension, They might display images of famous warriors or scenes from classical literature that emphasized loyalty and duty. The collection was constantly updated, with new works commissioned from living artists and old works retired to storage when their themes were no longer appropriate. The castle's music was as carefully orchestrated as its visual arts. The shogun employed musicians who specialized in the traditional instruments of the court, the biwa, the shamisen, the koto, and various types of drums and flutes. These musicians performed not only for entertainment, but also for ceremonial occasions, their music marking the rhythm of castle life. Different pieces were played at different times of day, during different seasons, and for different types of events. The music was never loud or jarring, but instead flowed like water, creating an atmosphere of calm and refinement. In the evening, lamps were lit in quiet succession, rooms dimmed one by one. The corridors darkened, and the scent of warm rice and broth briefly filled the air. Musicians sometimes played soft music on shamisen or koto, their notes echoing faintly through paper walls. The evening routine of the castle was as elaborate as its daily ceremonies. As the sun set, servants began the process of lighting the hundreds of lamps that would illuminate the castle through the night. This was done in a specific order, beginning with the most important chambers and working outward to the less significant rooms. The process took nearly an hour, and the quality of oil used in each lamp reflected the importance of the room it illuminated. The shogun's evening meal was the most elaborate of the day, featuring dishes that had been prepared throughout the afternoon. The meal was served in the traditional style, with numerous small dishes arranged on individual trays. Each dish was a work of art, its presentation as important as its taste. The shogun ate in silence, surrounded by attendants who anticipated his every need. The meal was followed by a brief period of entertainment, perhaps a performance by court musicians or a recitation of classical poetry. And then, silence returned. The guards resumed their posts. The officials retired to their quarters. And in the center of the great compound, the castle slept. But even in sleep, the castle maintained its vigilance. Night guards patrolled the grounds in carefully coordinated patterns. Their routes planned to ensure that no area was left unwatched for more than a few minutes. The guards carried special lanterns that could be shuttered to avoid attracting attention, and they communicated with each other through a system of subtle sounds. The tap of a staff against a stone, the rustle of clothing, the soft whistle of wind through bamboo. Any unusual sound or movement would be investigated immediately and reported through the chain of command. The castle's defenses were as much psychological as physical. The knowledge that one was constantly observed, that every action was noted and recorded, that the slightest deviation from expected behavior would be reported and investigated, created an atmosphere of total control. This control was not harsh or oppressive in the usual sense. It was gentle, almost invisible, like the soft pressure of water against a dam. But it was absolute, and everyone within the castle walls understood its presence. To live within Edo Castle was to live within structure, to understand your place, to speak when allowed, to move only as needed. It was a world of discipline, of observation, and of deep, measured calm. Yet this structure was not empty formalism. It served a purpose that went beyond mere ceremony or the display of power. The elaborate rituals and careful hierarchies of the castle were designed to create a kind of social harmony, a way of living together that minimized conflict and maximized cooperation. Every person had their place, every action had its meaning, and every day unfolded according to patterns that had been refined over generations. The castle was also a center of learning and culture. Its libraries contained not only the classic texts of Chinese and Japanese philosophy, but also works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural history. Scholars from across Japan came to study these collections, and the castle scribes were constantly at work, copying important texts and creating new works. The shogun himself was expected to be not only a political leader, but also a patron of the arts and a scholar in his own right. The influence of the castle extended far beyond its walls. The customs and ceremonies developed within its chambers were copied throughout Japan, creating a unified culture of refinement and discipline. The language of the court, the styles of dress, the forms of entertainment, and even the ways of thinking about political and social questions all spread outward from the castle to influence Japanese society as a whole. As we leave its polished corridors behind, we return once more to the world outside, to the soft night air over the rooftops, to the hum of crickets in the palace gardens, and to the faint light of the moon resting on the stone walls. From village paths to wandering swordsmen, from secret faith to silent halls of power, the world of Tokugawa Japan was built on layers. Each life connected by ritual, by role, and by a shared understanding that silence could hold more meaning than words. The seasonal rhythms of the castle were as carefully orchestrated as its daily ceremonies. Spring brought the cherry blossom viewing, when the shogun and his court would gather in the gardens to contemplate the fleeting beauty of the sakura. These gatherings were moments of rare relaxation, when the normal strictures of court life were temporarily softened. Poets would compose verses on the spot, inspired by the pink petals that drifted on the breeze. Musicians would play gentle melodies that seemed to capture the essence of the season's renewal. Even the food served during these occasions was designed to reflect the spring theme, with dishes featuring young vegetables and delicate flavors that celebrated the earth's awakening. Summer brought different rituals. The castle's residents would gather in the evening to listen to the sound of insects, particularly the crickets, whose songs were considered essential to the proper appreciation of the season. Special screens were erected to create outdoor rooms where courtiers could enjoy the cooler air, while still maintaining the privacy and hierarchy that defined castle life. The shogun's summer robes were made of the finest silk gauze, so thin they seemed to float around his body, while his fans were crafted from rare materials and decorated with images of flowing water and distant mountains. Autumn was the season of moon viewing, when the castle's inhabitants would gather on specially constructed platforms to observe the full moon's journey across the night sky. These gatherings combined aesthetic appreciation with philosophical contemplation, as participants composed poetry inspired by the moon's beauty and discussed the Buddhist concept of impermanence. The autumn moon was considered the most beautiful of the year, its light clear and cold, free from the haze of summer or the obscuring clouds of winter. The castle's gardens were carefully planned to frame this celestial display, with maples and other deciduous trees positioned to create natural windows through which the moon could be viewed. Winter brought the castle's most solemn ceremonies. The New Year celebrations lasted for days, with elaborate rituals designed to ensure good fortune for the coming year. The shogun would perform purification ceremonies at the family shrine, while his retainers would participate in formal exchanges of gifts and pledges of loyalty. The castle's halls would be decorated with pine branches and bamboo, symbols of longevity and resilience. Special foods were prepared according to ancient recipes, each dish carrying symbolic meaning for health, prosperity, and harmony. The castle's relationship with the outside world was complex and carefully managed. While it stood as a symbol of isolation and control, it was also connected to a vast network of information and influence that extended throughout Japan and beyond. The shogun's intelligence system gathered reports from every corner of the archipelago, monitoring everything from rice harvest to religious movements to the activities of foreign ships in distant ports. This information flowed into the castle through a carefully structured hierarchy of messengers and officials. Each piece of intelligence evaluated and prioritized according to its importance to the stability of the realm. The castle's influence on Japanese culture extended far beyond politics and administration. The aesthetic principles developed within its walls, the concepts of refined taste and subtle beauty, became the standards by which all Japanese art and culture were measured. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry, and painting all bore the stamp of castle refinement. Even the way people spoke, the elaborate system of honorific language that characterized Japanese society, was largely developed and codified within the castle's chambers. The economic impact of the castle was enormous. The shogun's household employed thousands of people directly, from high-ranking officials to lowly servants. The castle's needs for food, clothing, artwork, and other goods supported entire industries throughout Japan. The finest craftsmen in the country competed for the privilege of supplying the shogun's household, and a reputation for castle work could make a merchant's fortune. The castle's demand for luxury goods helped to drive innovation in many fields, from silk weaving to metalworking to the cultivation of rare foods. The castle also served as a center of technological innovation. The shogun's engineers were constantly working to improve the castle's defenses, communications, and living conditions. They developed new techniques for preserving food, for heating large spaces efficiently, and for managing the complex water systems that supplied the castle's needs. Some of these innovations eventually spread to the wider population, improving the quality of life for ordinary Japanese. The educational function of the castle was equally important. Young samurai from across Japan came to serve in the castle as pages, and attendants, learning not only the practical skills of administration, but also the cultural and intellectual traditions that define Japanese civilization. These young men would eventually return to their home domains, carrying with them the knowledge and perspectives they had gained in the capital. In this way, the castle served as a kind of university, spreading a common culture and set of values throughout the samurai class. The castle's libraries and archives were treasure troves of knowledge. In addition to the classic texts of Chinese and Japanese philosophy, they contained detailed records of Japanese history, genealogies of important families, maps of the entire country, and reports on every aspect of Japanese life. Scholars from across the country would petition for access to these collections, and the castle scribes were constantly at work, copying important texts and compiling new works. The shogun himself was expected to be well versed in these materials, and his education included intensive study of history, literature, and political theory. The role of women in the castle, while often overlooked in historical accounts, was crucial to its functioning. The joku was not merely a residence for the shogun's wives and concubines. It was a complex political and social institution in its own right. The women of the joku maintained their own networks of information and influence, often serving as intermediaries between the shogun and the outside world. They were skilled in the arts of diplomacy and negotiation, and their opinions on political matters were often sought and valued. The women of the castle were also patrons of the arts. They commissioned works from the finest artists and craftsmen, and their taste and preferences helped to shape Japanese aesthetic standards. The textile arts, in particular, flourished under their patronage, with elaborate kimonos and obi that were masterpieces of design and craftsmanship. The gardens of the juku were designed according to feminine aesthetic principles, emphasizing subtle beauty and intimate spaces, rather than the grand vistas preferred in the public areas of the castle. The children born within the castle walls lived in a world of almost unimaginable privilege and restriction. They were waited on by dozens of servants, educated by the finest tutors, and surrounded by luxury. Yet they were also subject to the same rigid protocols that governed adult life in the castle. Their education was comprehensive and demanding, including not only academic subjects, but also the arts of war, diplomacy, and court ceremony. They learned to read and write in both Japanese and Chinese, to compose poetry, to play musical instruments, and to conduct themselves with the dignity befitting their station. The castle's medical facilities were among the most advanced in Japan. The shogun's personal physicians were scholar doctors who had studied both traditional Chinese medicine and newer Western techniques that had been introduced by Dutch traders. They maintained detailed records of the shogun's health, prescribing treatments based on careful observation and analysis. The castle's pharmacy contained rare herbs and medicines from across Asia, and its medical library included texts on anatomy, surgery, and disease treatment that were not available elsewhere in Japan. The spiritual life of the castle was equally complex. While the Tokugawa family officially supported Buddhism, they also maintained Shinto shrines and practiced Confucian rituals. The castle's religious ceremonies were elaborate affairs that combined elements from all three traditions, creating a unique synthesis that reflected the syncretic nature of Japanese spirituality. The shogun was expected to participate in these ceremonies, not merely as a political leader, but as a spiritual figure, responsible for maintaining the harmony between heaven and earth. The castle's influence on Japanese language and literature was profound. The elaborate system of honorific speech that characterized Japanese society was largely developed within the castle's walls, as courtiers sought ever more refined ways to express respect and deference. The castle's poets and writers created works that became classics of Japanese literature, their themes and styles influencing generations of subsequent writers. The aesthetic principles developed within the castle, particularly the concept of mono no aware or the pathos of things, became fundamental to Japanese cultural identity. The castle's military function, while often overlooked in times of peace, remained crucial to its identity. The shogun's personal guard consisted of the finest warriors in Japan, men who had been selected not only for their martial skills, but also for their absolute loyalty to the Tokugawa family. These guards trained constantly, maintaining their skills through elaborate exercises and mock battles. Their weapons and armor were works of art, crafted by the finest swordsmiths and armorers in the country. The castle's relationship with the other daimyo was a delicate balance of cooperation and control. The system of Sankin Katai, which required the daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, brought a constant stream of visitors to the castle. These visits were elaborate affairs, with each daimyo bringing hundreds of retainers and tons of gifts. The castle's protocol officers worked tirelessly to ensure that these visits proceeded smoothly, with proper attention paid to questions of precedence and honor. The castle's impact on Japanese cuisine was significant. The shogun's kitchen employed dozens of cooks who specialized in different regional styles of cooking, creating a synthesis of flavors from across Japan. The elaborate kaiseki meals served at the castle became the standard for formal dining throughout the country, with their careful attention to seasonal ingredients and aesthetic presentation. The castle's tea masters developed new varieties of tea and refined the rituals surrounding its preparation and consumption. The castle's gardens were not merely decorative, but served important practical and symbolic functions. The various gardens within the castle grounds provided food, medicine, and materials for crafts and ceremonies. The herb gardens supplied the castle's pharmacy, while the vegetable gardens helped to feed the thousands of people who lived and worked within the castle walls. The ornamental gardens served as outdoor rooms where important meetings and ceremonies could be held, their design carefully planned to create the appropriate atmosphere for different types of gatherings. The castle's workshops and studios were centers of artistic innovation. The finest craftsmen in Japan worked within the castle walls, creating everything from elaborate kimonos to delicate lacquerware to massive architectural elements. These artisans were not merely skilled laborers, but were considered artists in their own right, their work contributing to the castle's reputation for refined taste and cultural sophistication. The techniques and styles developed within the castle workshops spread throughout Japan, influencing the development of Japanese crafts for centuries to come. The castle's administrative functions were equally important. The shogun's government employed thousands of officials who managed everything from tax collection to public works to foreign relations. The castle's administrative offices were models of efficiency and organization, with detailed records kept of every aspect of government business. The filing systems and bureaucratic procedures developed within the castle became the standard for government administration throughout Japan. The castle's role in Japanese diplomacy was crucial. Foreign ambassadors and traders who visited Japan were received at the castle, where they were impressed by displays of Japanese culture and power. The castle's protocol officers were skilled in the arts of diplomacy, able to conduct negotiations while maintaining Japanese dignity and interests. The gifts exchanged during these diplomatic encounters were carefully chosen to reflect Japanese aesthetic values and cultural sophistication. The castle's influence on Japanese fashion was enormous. The styles of dress favored by the shogun and his court set trends that spread throughout Japanese society. The elaborate kimonos worn by the castle's inhabitants featured the finest materials and most sophisticated designs, created by master weavers and dyers who guarded their techniques jealously. The colors and patterns favored at the castle became the standard for formal wear throughout Japan, with subtle variations indicating the wearer's social status and regional origin. The castle's daily routines were punctuated by countless small rituals and ceremonies that reinforced the hierarchical structure of Japanese society. The way tea was served, the order in which people entered and left rooms, the positioning of objects on tables and shelves, all carried symbolic meaning that was understood by those who lived within the castle walls. These rituals were not empty formalities, but served important social functions, helping to maintain order and harmony within the complex community of the castle. The castle's relationship with nature was carefully cultivated and deeply symbolic. The changing seasons were not merely observed, but celebrated through elaborate ceremonies and artistic displays. The castle's gardens were designed to provide different experiences throughout the year, with flowering trees and shrubs carefully chosen to create a succession of beautiful scenes. The sound of water, the rustling of leaves, the songs of birds, all were considered essential elements of the castle's atmosphere, carefully managed to create the desired effect. The castle's influence on Japanese education was profound. The shogun's own education set the standard for what was considered appropriate learning for a ruler, and this model was copied throughout Japan. The castle's schools trained not only the children of the shogun's family, but also the sons of important retainers and visiting daimyo. The curriculum included not only academic subjects, but also the arts of war, diplomacy, and court ceremony, creating a generation of leaders who shared common values and perspectives. The castle's impact on Japanese commerce was significant. The shogun's household was one of the largest consumers of luxury goods in Japan, and the castle's purchasing power helped to drive innovation and competition among merchants and craftsmen. The castle's standards for quality and craftsmanship became the benchmark for excellence throughout Japan, with the phrase suitable for the castle becoming the highest praise that could be given to any product. The procurement process for the castle was itself a complex art. Special agents, known as goyotashi, traveled throughout Japan seeking the finest products for the shogun's household. These men were experts in evaluating quality, able to distinguish between grades of silk that might seem identical to untrained eyes, or to detect the subtle differences in taste that separated ordinary sake from the extraordinary. They maintained relationships with craftsmen and merchants across the country, often commissioning works years in advance to ensure they would be ready when needed. The castle's influence extended to the development of new crafts and techniques. The demand for ever more refined and beautiful objects pushed artisans to innovate constantly. New methods of dyeing silk were developed to create colors that had never been seen before. Metalworkers devised new alloys and techniques for creating objects that were both functional and beautiful. Woodworkers developed new joinery, techniques that allowed them to create furniture and architectural elements of unprecedented complexity and refinement. The castle's library system was one of the most sophisticated in the world. The main library contained over 100,000 volumes, including rare manuscripts from China and Korea, as well as works by Japanese scholars and poets. The organization of these materials was itself a scholarly endeavor, with librarians who were experts in cataloging and cross-referencing. The castle maintained multiple copies of important works, storing them in different locations to protect against fire or other disasters. The copying and preservation of texts was a major industry within the castle. Teams of skilled scribes worked constantly to create new copies of important works, using techniques that had been perfected over generations. The paper used for these copies was made from the finest materials, treated with substances that would help preserve it for centuries. The ink was made from special formulations that would not fade or blur over time. Even the brushes used for writing were crafted with extraordinary care, their tips shaped to create exactly the right kind of line. The castle's music program was extensive and sophisticated. The shogun maintained orchestras that specialized in different types of music, from the ancient court music of the Heian period to newer forms that incorporated elements from popular culture. The musicians were not merely performers, but were expected to be composers and scholars as well, able to discuss the theoretical foundations of their art and to adapt traditional pieces for different occasions and audiences. The castle's theatrical traditions were equally rich. The shogun's court maintained its own troupe of actors, who performed both classical dramas and newer works created specifically for court audiences. These performances were elaborate affairs, with costumes and sets that were works of art in themselves. The actors were trained from childhood in the complex arts of movement, voice, and expression that characterized Japanese theater. Their performances were not merely entertainment, but were considered essential to the cultural education of the court. The castle's relationship with time was complex and deeply symbolic. The official calendar was based on Chinese models, but the castle also maintained its own system of marking important dates and anniversaries. The shogun's birth, the founding of the Tokugawa dynasty, important military victories, and other significant events were all commemorated with special ceremonies and observances. The castle's astronomers calculated the exact times for these ceremonies, ensuring that they would take place at the most auspicious moments. The castle's water management system was a marvel of engineering. The complex required enormous quantities of water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and maintaining the gardens. A sophisticated network of pipes, channels, and reservoirs distributed water throughout the castle, with different grades of water for different purposes. The drinking water came from specially protected sources and was filtered through layers of sand and charcoal. The water for the gardens was treated differently, with nutrients added to promote plant growth. The castle's waste management was equally sophisticated. Human waste was collected and processed according to strict protocols, with different methods used for different areas of the castle. The waste from the shogun's private quarters was handled by specially trained servants, who were sworn to secrecy about what they might observe. Organic waste from the kitchens was composted and used to fertilize the gardens. Even the ash from the many fires that heated the castle was collected and recycled, used in the production of soap and other cleaning products. The castle's communication systems were designed to ensure that information could flow quickly and accurately throughout the complex. A network of messengers and signal systems allowed orders to be transmitted from the shogun's chambers to the farthest corners of the castle in minutes. Different types of messages were coded with different colors and symbols, allowing recipients to understand their urgency and importance at a glance. The castle also maintained a sophisticated system of written communications, with different types of documents for different purposes and audiences. The castle's relationship with the natural world was carefully managed and deeply spiritual. The shogun's court included specialists in observing and interpreting natural phenomena, from the movements of the stars to the behavior of animals to the patterns of weather. These observations were not merely scientific, but were considered essential to understanding the will of heaven and the proper conduct of human affairs. The castle's gardens were designed to provide habitats for specific types of birds and insects, whose presence was considered essential to the proper functioning of the natural order. The castle's influence on Japanese poetry was profound. The shogun's court was home to some of the finest poets in Japan, and their work set the standards for poetic excellence throughout the country. The castle's poetry competitions were major cultural events, with participants from across Japan submitting works for consideration. The winning poems were often inscribed on scrolls and displayed in the castle's public spaces, where they could be admired by visitors and residents alike. The castle's role in preserving Japanese cultural traditions was crucial. Many ancient customs and ceremonies that might otherwise have been lost were maintained within the castle walls. The shogun's court served as a repository of cultural knowledge, preserving everything from ancient recipes to forgotten musical compositions to obsolete forms of dance. This preservation work was not merely academic, but was considered essential to maintaining the cultural continuity that legitimized the Tokugawa rule. The castle's influence on Japanese architecture extended far beyond its own walls. The design principles developed within the castle, the integration of indoor and outdoor spaces, the use of natural materials, and the emphasis on proportion and harmony became the standard for high-quality architecture throughout Japan. The castle's architects were among the most skilled in the country, and their techniques were studied and copied by builders across the archipelago. The castle's workshop system was organized along guild lines, with master craftsmen taking apprentices who had learned their trades over many years. These workshops produced everything from the simplest household items to the most elaborate ceremonial objects. The quality of work produced within the castle workshops was legendary, and pieces created there were treasured by their recipients and passed down through generations as family heirlooms. The castle's relationship with the merchant class was complex and evolving. While the official social hierarchy placed merchants at the bottom of the social order, the castle's enormous consumption needs meant that successful merchants could accumulate great wealth and influence. The castle's procurement officers worked closely with merchant networks, and the most successful merchants were often granted special privileges and honors. Some merchant families became so wealthy and influential that they were essentially granted samurai status, though this was rarely acknowledged officially. The castle's influence on Japanese urban planning was significant. The layout of Edo itself was planned in relation to the castle, with the most important districts arranged in concentric circles around the castle grounds. The castle's needs for transportation, communication, and security shaped the development of the city's infrastructure. The broad avenues that led to the castle gates, the positioning of bridges and waterways, and the location of important buildings all reflected the castle's central role in the city's life. The castle's educational influence extended to the development of new forms of knowledge and scholarship. The shogun's court sponsored research into everything from astronomy to medicine to agriculture. The castle's scholars were among the most learned in Japan, and their work contributed to advances in many fields. The castle's libraries and laboratories were centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the country and even from abroad. The castle's role in Japanese diplomacy was not limited to formal state visits. The shogun's court maintained informal networks of communication with other Asian countries, often through Buddhist temples and trading relationships. These networks provided valuable intelligence about political and economic developments throughout the region. The castle's officials were skilled in the subtle arts of international relations, able to advance Japanese interests while maintaining the appearance of peaceful cooperation. The castle's influence on Japanese religious life was complex and multifaceted. While the Tokugawa officially supported Buddhism and used it as a tool of social control, the castle also maintained Shinto shrines and practiced Confucian rituals. The castle's religious ceremonies were elaborate syntheses of different traditions, creating unique forms of spiritual practice that reflected the syncretic nature of Japanese spirituality. The castle's priests and monks were among the most learned religious scholars in Japan, and their interpretations of doctrine influenced religious practice throughout the country. But beyond the castle walls, in the narrow streets and hidden corners of Edo, other forms of power were stirring. Where the castle represented order and control, the city itself pulsed with a different energy. Here, in the pleasure quarters and merchant districts, in the workshops of artisans, and the theaters of actors, another Japan was emerging. A Japan where money spoke louder than bloodlines, where talent mattered more than birth, and where the strict hierarchies of the samurai world were beginning to bend under the weight of commerce and creativity. The contrast between these two worlds, the world of the castle and the world of the street, would define the character of an age and set the stage for transformations that would echo through centuries to come. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the rigid routine of a samurai village to the solitary footsteps of a wandering swordsman. From whispered prayers in hidden rooms to the still, echoing halls of an Edo castle. A long, quiet journey through the layered, formal world of Tokugawa, Japan. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the rice quotas and the folding fans, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly walk through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always nice to see where in the world these late-night stories are being heard. For now, I'll let the village grow still, the footsteps of the swordsman fade into the trees, and the paper lanterns of Edo flicker out one by one. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.